The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. It was the evening on which Messieurs de Bienne and Poligny, the managers of the Paris Opera, were giving a last gala performance to mark their retirement. Suddenly, the dressing room of La Sorelli, one of the principal dancers, was invaded by half a dozen young ladies of the ballet. Sorelli looked round angrily as little Jeanne, the girl with the tip-tilted nose, exclaimed in a trembling voice, "It's the ghost!" And she locked the door. Sorelli shuddered when she heard little Jeanne speak of the ghost, called her a silly little fool, and then, as she was the first to believe in ghosts in general, and the opera ghost in particular, at once asked for details. "Have you seen him?" "As plainly as I see you now," said little Jeanne, whose legs were giving way beneath her, and she dropped with a moan into a chair. Thereupon little Giry added, "If that's the ghost, he's very ugly." "Oh, yes," cried the chorus of ballet girls, and they all began to talk together. The ghost had appeared to them in the shape of a gentleman in dress clothes, who had suddenly stood before them in the passage, without their knowing where he came from. He seemed to have come straight through the wall. "Pooh!" said one of them, who had more or less kept her head. "You see the ghost everywhere." And it was true. For several months there had been nothing discussed at the opera but this ghost in dress clothes, who stalked about the building from top to bottom like a shadow, who spoke to nobody, to whom nobody dared speak, and who vanished as soon as he was seen. Yet who had seen him? You meet so many men in dress clothes at the opera who are not ghosts. But this dress suit had a peculiarity of its own. It covered a skeleton. At least so the ballet girls said. And it had a death's head. The idea of the skeleton came from the description of the ghost given by Joseph Buguet, the chief scene shifter, who had really seen the ghost. He had run up against the ghost on the little staircase by the footlights which leads to the cellars. He had seen him for a second, for the ghost had fled, and to anyone who cared to listen to him he said, "He is extraordinarily thin, and his dress coat hangs on a skeleton frame. His eyes are so deep that you can hardly see the fixed pupils. You just see two big black holes, as in a dead man's skull. His skin, which is stretched across his bones like a drum head, a nasty yellow. His nose is so little that you can't see it side face, and the absence of that nose is a horrible thing to look at. All the hair he has is 3 or 4 long dark locks on his forehead and behind his ears." Sensible men said that Joseph Buguet had been the victim of a joke played by one of his assistants, and then there came an incident so curious and so inexplicable that the very shrewdest people began to feel uneasy. A fireman named Pompin, who had gone to make a round of inspection in the cellars, suddenly reappeared on the stage, pale and trembling. He had seen a head of fire without a body coming towards him. After that, could anyone be sure? The corps de ballet was flung into consternation. "It's the ghost!" little Jeanne cried. "Listen!" Everybody seemed to hear a rustling outside the door. There was no sound of footsteps. It was like light silk sliding over the panel, and then it stopped. Sorelli tried to show more pluck than the others. She went up to the door and in a quavering voice asked, "Is there anyone behind the door?" "Oh, yes, of course there is," cried little Meg Giry, holding Sorelli back. "Of course, whatever you do, don't open the door." But Sorelli turned the key and threw open the door, while the ballet girls retreated to the inner dressing room. Sorelli looked into the passage bravely. It was empty. A gas flame cast a red light into the surrounding darkness without succeeding in dispelling it. The dancer slammed the door with a deep sigh. "Come, children, pull yourselves together. I dare say no one has ever seen the ghost." Yes. We saw him just now," cried the girls. "He had his death's head and his dress coat just as when he appeared to Joseph Buguet." Joseph Buquet would do better to hold his tongue. That's Mother's opinion, replied Meg. Mother says the ghost doesn't like being talked about. And why does your mother say so? I swore not to tell, gasped Meg. But they promised to keep the secret, until Meg, burning to say all she knew, began with her eyes fixed on the door. Well, it's because of the private box. What private box? The ghost's box, said Meg. It's box 5. You know, the box on the grand tier next to the stage box on the left. Oh, nonsense. I tell you it is. Mother has charge of it. No one has had it for over a month except the ghost, and orders have been given at the box office that it must never be sold. And does the ghost really come there? Yes. Then somebody does come. Oh, why, no. The ghost comes, but there's nobody there. The ballet girls exchanged glances. If the ghost came to the box, he must be seen, because he wore a dress coat and a death's head. This was what they tried to make Meg understand, but she replied, That's just it. The ghost is not seen, and he had no dress coat and no head. All that talk about the death's head, his head of fire, it's nonsense. You only hear him when he's in the box. Mother has never seen him, but she's heard him. Mother knows, because she gives him his program. Thereupon little Giry began to cry. I ought to have held my tongue if Mother ever came to know. Joseph Buquet had no business to talk of things that don't concern him. It will bring bad luck. Mother was saying so last night. There was a sound of hurried footsteps in the passage, and a breathless voice cried, Cécile! Cécile! Are you there? It's Mother's voice, cried Jeanne. What's the matter? She opened the door. A plump lady burst into the dressing room and dropped, groaning, into a vacant chair. How awful, she said. Joseph Buquet is dead. He was found hanging in the 3rd floor cellar. It's the ghost, little Giry blurted. All around her, her panic-stricken companions repeated under their breaths, Yes, yes, it must be the ghost. The horrid news soon spread all over the opera, where Joseph Buquet was very popular. The dressing rooms emptied, and the ballet girls, crowding around Sorelli like timid sheep around their shepherdess, made for the foyer through the ill-lit passages and stairways. On the first landing, Sorelli ran against the Comte de Chagny, who was coming upstairs. The Count, who was generally so calm, seemed greatly excited. I was just going to you, he said, taking off his hat. Oh, Sorelli, what an evening! And Christine Day, what a triumph! Impossible, said Meg Giry. 6 months ago she used to sing like a crock. But do let us get by, my dear Count. We're going to inquire after a poor man who was found hanging by the neck. Just then the acting manager came fussing past and stopped when he heard this remark. What? He exclaimed roughly. Have you girls heard already? Well, above all, don't let Monsieur de Bienne and Monsieur Poligny hear. It would upset them too much on their last day. They all went on to the foyer of the ballet, which was already full of people. The Comte de Chagny was right. No gala performance ever equaled this one. All the great composers of the day had conducted their own works in turn. Faure and Krauss had sung, and on that evening Christine Day had revealed her true self for the first time to the astonished and enthusiastic audience. She had begun by singing a few passages from Romeo and Juliet. Those who heard her say that her voice in the passages was seraphic, but this was nothing to the superhuman notes that she gave forth in the prison scene and the final trio in Faust, which she sang in the place of La Carlotta, who was ill. No one had ever heard or seen anything like it. Day revealed a new Margarita that night, a Margarita of a splendor, a radiance hitherto unsuspected. The whole house went mad, rising to its feet, shouting, cheering, clapping, while Christine sobbed and fainted in the arms of her fellow singers and had to be carried to her dressing room. Till then, Christine Day had played a good Siebel to Carlotta's rather too splendidly material Margarita, and it had needed Carlotta's incomprehensible and inexcusable absence from this gala night for the little Day, at a moment's warning, to show all that she could do in a part of the program reserved for the Spanish diva. What the subscribers wanted to know was, why had de Bienne and Poligny used Day when Carlotta was taken ill? Did they know of her hidden genius? And why had she kept it hidden? Oddly enough, she was not known to have a professor of singing at that moment. The whole thing was a mystery. The Comte de Chagny, standing up in his box, listened to all this frenzy and took part in it by loudly applauding. Philippe Georges Marie, Comte de Chagny, was just 41 years of age. He was a great aristocrat and a good-looking man, exquisitely polite to the women and a little haughty to the men. On the death of old Count Philibert, he became the head of one of the oldest and most distinguished families in France. His brother, Raoul, was born 20 years after him. At the time of the old Count's death, Raoul was 12 years of age. Philippe busied himself actively with the youngster's education. He was admirably assisted in this work, first by his sisters and afterward by an old aunt. Raoul had retained from this purely feminine education manners that were candid and stamped with a charm that nothing had yet been able to sully. He was a little over 21 years of age and looked 18. He had a small, fair moustache, beautiful blue eyes, and a complexion like a girl's. Philippe spoiled Raoul. He took him with him wherever he went. He even introduced him to the foyer of the ballet, where the Count was said to be on terms with Sorelli. He used to come and spend an hour or two after dinner in the company of the dancer, who, though not very witty, had the finest eyes that ever were seen. Philippe would perhaps not have taken his brother behind the scenes of the opera if Raoul had not been the first to ask him, repeatedly renewing his request with a gentle obstinacy which the Count remembered at a later date. On that evening, Philippe, after applauding Christine Day, turned to Raoul and saw that he was quite pale. "Don't you see," said Raoul, "that the woman's fainting?" "You look like fainting yourself," said the Count. "What's the matter?" But Raoul had recovered himself and was standing up. "Let's go and see. She never sang like that before." The Count gave his brother a curious, smiling glance and seemed quite pleased, but he now understood why Raoul was absent-minded when spoken to, and why he always tried to turn every conversation to the subject of the opera. Postponing his usual visit to Sorelli for a few minutes, the Count followed his brother down the passage that led to Day's dressing-room and saw that it had been so crammed as on that evening, when the whole house seemed excited by her success and also by her fainting fit. The girl had not yet come to, and the doctor of the theatre had just arrived at the moment when Raoul entered at his heels. Christine, therefore, received first aid of the one, while opening her eyes in the arms of the other. The Count and many more remained crowding in the doorway. "Don't you think, Doctor, that those gentlemen had better clear the room?" asked Raoul coolly. "There's no breathing here." "You're quite right," said the doctor, and he sent everyone away except Raoul and the maid, who looked at Raoul with eyes of the most undisguised astonishment. She'd never seen him before, and yet dared not question him, and the doctor imagined that the young man was only acting as he did because he had the right to. Christine Day uttered a deep sigh. She turned her head, saw Raoul, and started. "Monsieur," she said, "who are you?" "Mademoiselle," replied the young man, kneeling on one knee and pressing a fervent kiss on the diva's hand, "I am the little boy who went into the sea to rescue your scarf." Christine again looked at the doctor and the maid, and all three began to laugh. Raoul turned very red and stood up. "Mademoiselle, since you are pleased not to recognize me, I should like to say something to you in private, something very important." "When I am better, do you mind?" And her voice shook. "You have been very good." "Yes, you must go," said the doctor with his pleasant smile. "Leave me to attend to mademoiselle." Christine rose and passed her hand over her eyelids. "Thank you, doctor. I should like to be alone. Please go away, all of you. Leave me. I feel very restless this evening." The doctor tried to protest, but seeing the girl's evident agitation, he thought the best remedy was not to thwart her. He went away, saying to Raoul outside, "She's not herself tonight. She's usually so gentle." Then he said good night, and Raoul was left alone. The whole of this part of the theatre was now deserted. The farewell ceremony was no doubt taking place in the foyer of the ballet. Raoul thought that Day might go to it, and he waited in the shadow of the doorway. He felt a terrible pain at his heart, and it was of this that he wanted to speak to Day without delay. Suddenly, the dressing-room door opened, and the maid came out by herself, carrying bundles. He stopped her and asked her how her mistress was. The woman laughed and said that she was quite well, but that he must not disturb her, for she wished to be left alone, and she passed on. One idea alone filled Raoul's burning brain. Of course, Day wished to be left alone. For him? Had he not told her that he wanted to speak to her privately? Hardly breathing, he went up to the dressing-room and, with his ear to the door to catch her reply, prepared to knock. But his hand dropped. He had heard a man's voice in the dressing-room, saying, in a curiously masterful tone, "Christine, you must love me." And Christine's voice, infinitely sad and trembling as though accompanied by tears, replied, "How can you talk like that when I sing only for you?" The man's voice spoke again. "Are you very tired?" "Oh, tonight I gave you my soul, and I am exhausted," Christine replied. "Your soul is a beautiful thing, child," replied the grave man's voice. "And I thank you. No emperor ever received so fair a gift. The angels wept tonight." Raoul heard nothing after that. He leaned against the door, hating himself for what he'd just heard. Nevertheless, he did not go away, but returned to his dark corner, determined to wait for the man to leave the room. He knew that he loved Christine with all his heart. Now he wanted to know his rival. To his great astonishment, the door opened, and Christine Day came out alone, wrapped in furs, with her face hidden in a lace veil. She closed the door behind her, but did not lock it. She passed him. He did not even follow her, for his eyes were fixed on the door, which remained firmly closed. When the passage was once more deserted, he crossed it, opened the door of the dressing-room, went in and shut the door. He found himself in absolute darkness. The gas had been turned out. "There is someone here," said Raoul, with his back against the closed door, in a quivering voice. "What are you hiding for?" All was darkness and silence. Raoul heard only the sound of his own breathing. He struck a match. The blaze lit up the room. There was no one in the room. He went into the dressing-closet, opened the cupboards, hunted about, felt the walls with his moist hands. Nothing. He went out, not knowing where he was going. He found himself at the bottom of a staircase, and behind him a procession of workmen were carrying a stretcher covered with a white sheet. Pointing to the stretcher, he asked, "What's that?" The workman answered, "That is Joseph Piquet, who was found in the third cellar, hanging between a farmhouse and a scene from the Rio de Lahore." He fell back to make room for the procession and went out. During this time, the farewell ceremony was being given on the occasion of the retirement of Monsieur de Bienne and Monsieur Poligny. Everybody remarked that the retiring managers looked cheerful, and they were already smiling broadly upon Sorelli, who had begun to recite her speech. when an exclamation from little Jam broke the smile of the managers. "The opera ghost!" Jam yelled these words in a tone of unspeakable terror, and her finger pointed among the crowd of dandies to a face so pallid and so ugly, with two such deep black cavities under the straddling brows, that the death's head in question immediately scored a huge success. "The opera ghost!" Everybody laughed and pushed his neighbour and wanted to offer the opera ghost a drink, but he was gone. He had slipped through the crowd, and the others vainly hunted for him, while two old gentlemen tried to calm little Jam, and while little Giry stood screaming like a peacock. Sorelli was furious. She had not been able to finish her speech. The managers had kissed her, thanked her, and run away as fast as the ghost himself. They found the new managers, M. Armand Moncharmin and M. Firmin Richard, whom they hardly knew. Nevertheless, the retiring managers handed over to their successors the two tiny master keys which opened all the doors of the opera house. M. Armand Moncharmin, in chapter 11 of his memoirs, says, "When I think of this first evening, I cannot separate the secret confided to us by Messieurs de Bienne and Poligny in their office from the presence at our supper of that ghostly person whom none of us knew. Messieurs de Bienne and Poligny seemed to grow more and more excited, and they appeared to have something very difficult to tell us. Monsieur Poligny went to his desk and returned with a copy of the memorandum book. The memorandum book begins with the well-known words saying that the management of the opera shall give to the performance of the National Academy of Music the splendor that becomes the first lyric stage in France, and ends with clause 98, which says that the privilege can be withdrawn if the manager infringes the conditions stipulated in the memorandum book. This is followed by the conditions, which are 4 in number. The copy produced by M. Poligny was written in black ink, and exactly similar to that in our possession, except that at the end it contained a paragraph in red ink, and in a queer laboured handwriting, the writing of a child that had never got beyond the down strokes, and has not yet learned to join its letters. This paragraph ran word for word as follows. 5. Or if the manager in any month delay for more than a fortnight the payment of the allowance which he shall make to the opera ghost, an allowance of 20,000 francs a month, say 240,000 francs a year. M. Poligny pointed with a hesitating finger to this last clause, which we certainly did not expect. Is this all? Does he not want anything else? Asked Richard with the greatest coolness. Yes, he does, replied Poligny, and he turned over the pages of the memorandum book until he came to the clause specifying the days on which certain private boxes were to be reserved for the free use of the President of the Republic, the ministers, and so on, and at the end of this clause a line had been added, also in red ink. Box 5 on the grand tier shall be placed at the disposal of the opera ghost for every performance. When we saw this, there was nothing else for us to do but to rise from our chairs, shake our two predecessors warmly by the hand, and congratulate them on thinking of this charming little joke. Richard added that he now understood why Messieurs de Bienne and Poligny were retiring from the management of the National Academy of Music. Business was impossible with so unreasonable a ghost. Yes, said M. de Bienne, we prefer to go away. Richard said, but it seems to me that you were much too kind to the ghost. If I had such a troublesome ghost as that, I should not hesitate to have him arrested. But how? Where? They cried in chorus. We have never seen him. But when he comes to his box, we have never seen him in his box. Then sell it. Sell the opera ghost box? Well, gentlemen, try it. Thereupon we all 4 left the office. Richard and I had never laughed so much in our lives. Armand Moncharmin did not know a note of music, but he called the Minister of Education and Fine Arts by his Christian name, and enjoyed a considerable private income. He was a charming fellow, and showed that he was not lacking in intelligence, for as soon as he made up his mind to be a sleeping partner in the opera, he selected the best possible active manager, and went straight to Firmin Richard. Firmin Richard was a very distinguished composer, who had published a number of successful pieces of all kinds, and who liked nearly every form of music and every sort of musician. The only things to be said against him were that he was rather masterful in his ways, and endowed with a very hasty temper. The first few days which the new partners spent at the opera were given over to the delight of finding themselves the head of so magnificent an enterprise, and they had forgotten all about that curious story of the ghost, when an incident occurred that proved to them that the joke, if joke it were, was not over. Monsieur Firmin Richard reached his office that morning at 11 o'clock. His secretary, Monsieur Remy, showed him half a dozen letters which he had not opened because they were marked private. One of the letters had at once attracted Richard's attention, not only because the envelope was addressed in red ink, but because he seemed to have seen the writing before. He soon remembered that it was the red handwriting in which the memorandum book had been so curiously completed. He recognized the clumsy, childish hand. He opened the letter and read, "Dear Monsieur Manager, I am sorry to have to trouble you at a time when you must be so very busy, renewing important engagements, signing fresh ones, and generally displaying your excellent taste. I am speaking of Christine Day, for her genius is certain, but your jealousy prevents her from creating an important part. All the same, I should like to hear her this evening in the part of Sibyl, as that of Margarita has been forbidden her since her triumph of the other evening. And I will ask you not to dispose of my box today, nor on the following days, for I cannot end this letter without telling you how disagreeably surprised I have been to hear, on arriving at the opera, that my box had been sold by your orders. I did not protest, first, because I dislike scandal, and second, because I thought that your predecessors, Messieurs Debienne and Poligny, who were always charming to me, had neglected, before leaving, to mention my privileges to you. I have now received a reply from those gentlemen to my letter asking for an explanation, and this reply proves that you know all about my memorandum book, and consequently that you are treating me with outrageous contempt. If you wish to live in peace, you must not begin by taking away my private box. Believe me to be, dear Monsieur Manager, your most humble and obedient servant, Opera Ghost." Monsieur Firmin Richard had hardly finished reading this letter when Monsieur Armand Moncharmin entered, carrying one exactly similar. They looked at each other and burst out laughing. "They're keeping up the joke," said Monsieur Richard. "It's harmless enough," observed Armand Moncharmin. "What is it they really want? A box for tonight?" Monsieur Firmin Richard told his secretary to send box 5 on the grand tier to Messieurs Debienne and Poligny if it was not sold. It was not. It was sent off to them. Debienne lived at the corner of the Rue Scribe and the Boulevard des Capucines. Poligny in the Rue Aubert. Oh, ghosts, 2 letters, had been posted at the Boulevard des Capucines post office, as Moncharmin remarked after examining the envelopes. "You see," said Richard. They shrugged their shoulders and regretted that 2 men of that age should amuse themselves with such childish tricks. Next morning, the managers received a card of thanks from the ghost. "Dear Monsieur Manager, thanks. Charming evening. Day exquisite. Choruses want waking up. Carlotta, a splendid, commonplace instrument. Will write you soon for the 240,000 francs, or 233,424 francs and 70 centimes to be correct. Messieurs de Bienne and Poligny have sent me the 6,575 francs and 30 centimes, representing the first 10 days of my allowance for the current year. Their privileges finished on the evening of the 10th instant. Kind regards, O.G. On the other hand, there was a letter from Messieurs de Bienne and Poligny. Gentlemen, we are much obliged for your kind thought of us, but you will easily understand that the prospect of again hearing Faust, pleasant though it is to ex-managers of the opera, cannot make us forget that we have no right to occupy Box 5 on the Grand Tier, which is the exclusive property of him of whom we spoke to you when we went through the memorandum book with you for the last time. See Clause 98, final paragraph. Accept, gentlemen, etc., etc. "Oh, these fellows are beginning to annoy me," shouted Firmin Richard, snatching up the letter. And that evening, Box 5 was sold. Christine Day, owing to intrigues to which I will return later, did not immediately continue her triumph at the opera. After the famous gala night, she sang once at the Duchess de Zurich's, but this was the last occasion on which she was heard in private. She refused to appear at a charity concert to which she had promised her assistance. She acted throughout as though she were no longer the mistress of her own destiny, and as though she feared a fresh triumph. She showed herself nowhere, and the Vicomte de Chagny tried in vain to meet her. He wrote to her, asking to call upon her, but despaired of receiving a reply when one morning she sent him the following note. "Monsieur, I have not forgotten the little boy who went into the sea to rescue my scarf. I feel that I must write to you today when I am going to Perrault, in fulfillment of a sacred duty. Tomorrow is the anniversary of the death of my poor father, whom you knew and who was very fond of you. He is buried there with his violin in the graveyard of the little church at the bottom of the slope where we used to play as children and where we said goodbye for the last time." Raoul, ecstatic at the thought of seeing her again, immediately took the night train to Perrault. The day was breaking when he alighted at Lannion. He hurried to the diligence for Perrault-Guirec. He was the only passenger. He questioned the driver and learned that on the evening of the previous day a young lady who looked like a Parisienne had gone to Perrault and put up at the inn known as the Setting Sun. The nearer he drew to her, the more fondly he remembered the story of the little Swedish singer. There was once, in a little market town not far from Uppsala, a peasant who lived there with his family, working during the week and singing in the choir on Sundays. This peasant had a little daughter to whom he taught the musical alphabet before she knew how to read. Day's father was a great musician without knowing it. Not a fiddler throughout the length and breadth of Scandinavia played as he did. His reputation was widespread, and he was always invited to set the couples dancing at weddings and other festivals. His wife died when Christine was entering upon her 6th year. One day, at Liemby Fair, Professor Valerius heard them and took them to Gothenburg. He maintained that the father was the first violinist in the world, and that the daughter had the making of a great artist. Her education and instruction were provided for. She made rapid progress and charmed everybody with her grace of manner and her eagerness to please. When Valerius and his wife went to settle in France, they took Day and Christine with them. Mamma Valerius treated Christine as her daughter. As for Day, he began to pine away with homesickness. Day seemed not to recover his strength until the summer, when the whole family went to stay at Perrault-Guirec, in a faraway corner of Brittany, where the sea was of the same colour as in his own country. Often he would play his saddest tunes on the beach and pretend that the sea stopped its roaring to listen to them. One day, Christine was walking by the sea, singing to herself in her usual fashion, when the wind blew her scarf far out on the waves. Just then, she heard a voice nearby say, Don't worry, I'll go and fetch your scarf. She turned and saw a little boy running into the sea. The next minute he was back, and both boy and scarf were soaked through. Christine laughed and kissed the little boy, who was none other than the Vicomte Raoul de Chagny, staying at Lannion with his aunt. That was the beginning of their friendship, and during the season they saw each other almost every day. At the aunt's request, and seconded by Professor Valerius, Day consented to give the young Viscount some violin lessons. In this way, Raoul learned to love the same airs that had charmed Christine's childhood. Then autumn came, and parted Raoul and Christine. Christine tried not to think of him, and devoted herself wholly to her art. She made wonderful progress, and those who heard her prophesied that she would be the greatest singer in the world. But then her father died very suddenly, and with this loss she seemed also to lose her genius. She retained just enough to enter the Conservatoire, where she did not distinguish herself, attending the classes without enthusiasm and taking a prize only to please old Madame Valerius. The first time that Raoul saw Christine at the opera, he was charmed by the girl's beauty and by the sweet images of the past which it evoked, but at the same time he was puzzled by her sadness. She seemed to have lost touch with things. He tried to attract her attention. More than once he walked after her to the door of her box, but she did not see him. She appeared, for that matter, to see nobody. She was all indifference. Raoul suffered, for she was very beautiful, while he was shy and dared not confess his love even to himself. And then came the revelation of that gala performance, when her angel's voice conquered his heart. And then there was that man's voice behind the door. "You must love me." And no one in the room. Why did she laugh when he reminded her of the incident of the scarf? Why did she not recognize him? And why had she now written to him? Raoul reached Perrault at last. He walked into the smoky parlour of the hotel, and Christine stood smiling before him. "You have come," she said. "I felt that I should find you here when I came back from Mass. Someone told me so at church." "Who?" asked Raoul, taking her little hand in his. "Why, my poor dead father." There was silence, and then Raoul asked, "Did your father tell you that I love you, Christine, and that I cannot live without you?" Christine blushed to the eyes and turned away her head. In a trembling voice she said, "I did not send for you to tell me such things." "You sent for me, Christine. You knew that your letter would not leave me indifferent and that I would hasten to Perrault. How can you have thought that if you did not think I loved you?" "I thought you would remember our games here as children, in which my father so often joined. I really don't know what I thought. Perhaps I was wrong to write to you. This anniversary and your sudden appearance in my room at the opera the other evening reminded me of the time long past and made me write to you." There was something in Christine's attitude that struck Raoul as not quite natural. He did not feel any hostility in her, far from it. The sad tenderness shining in her eyes told him that. But why was this tenderness so sad? That was what he wished to know, and what was irritating him. "But why do you think I came to you, if not out of love?" continued Raoul. "When you saw me in your dressing-room, was that the first time you noticed me, Christine?" She was incapable of lying. "No," she said. "I had often seen you in your brother's box." "I thought so," said Raoul, compressing his lips. "But then why, when you saw me in your room, at your feet, reminding you that I had rescued your scarf from the sea, why did you answer as though you did not know me, and why did you laugh?" The tone of these questions was so rough that Christine stared at Raoul without replying. "You don't answer," he said, angrily and unhappily. "Well, I will answer for you. It was because there was someone else in the room, Christine. Someone to whom you said, 'I sing only for you. Tonight I gave you my soul.' Christine seized Raoul's arm. "Then you were listening behind the door?" "Yes, because I love you, and I heard everything." "You heard what?" "He said to you, 'Christine, you must love me.'" At these words, a deathly pallor spread over Christine's face. "Go on," she commanded. "Go on. Tell me all you heard." At an utter loss to understand, Raoul answered, "I heard him reply when you said that you had given him your soul, 'Your soul is a beautiful thing, child, and I thank you. No emperor ever received so fair a gift. The angels wept tonight.'" Christine gave a cry of grief and pain. Raoul was terror-stricken and tried to take her in his arms, but she escaped and fled in great disorder. While Christine remained locked in her room, Raoul was at his wits' end what to do. He was told that Christine had gone to her bedroom, saying that she would not be down to dinner. Raoul dined alone, went to his room and tried to read, went to bed and tried to sleep. There was no sound in the next room. The hours passed slowly. It was about 11:30 when he distinctly heard someone moving with a light, stealthy step in the room next to his. Raoul dressed, taking care not to make a sound, and waited. His heart gave a bound when he heard Christine's door turn slowly on its hinges. Softly opening the door, he saw Christine in the moonlight slip along the passage. She went down the stairs, and he leant over the banister above her. Suddenly, he heard two voices in rapid conversation. He caught one sentence. "Don't lose the key." It was the landlady's voice. The door facing the sea was opened and locked again. Then all was still. Raoul ran back to his room and threw open the window. He could just make out Christine's white form on the deserted quay. The first floor of the setting sun was at no great height, and a tree growing against the wall enabled Raoul to climb down unknown to the landlady. The good woman's amazement, therefore, was great when the young man was brought back to her the next morning, half frozen and more dead than alive. When she learnt that he had been found stretched at full length on the steps of the high altar of the little church, she ran at once to tell Christine, who hurried down and did her best to revive him. He soon opened his eyes, and was not long in recovering when he saw his friend's charming face bent over him. A few weeks later, when the tragedy at the opera necessitated the intervention of the public prosecutor, Monsieur Mifroid, the commissaire of police, examined the Vicomte de Chagny, touching on the events of the night at Perrault. I quote the questions and answers as given in the official report. Question: Did Mademoiselle Day not see you come down from your room by the curious road which you selected? Reply: No, monsieur. Although when walking behind her I took no pains to deaden the sound of my footsteps. In fact, I was anxious that she should turn round and see me, but she seemed not to hear me and acted exactly as though I was not there. She quietly left the quay and then suddenly turned up the road. The church clock had struck 12:15, and I thought that this must have made her hurry, for she began almost to run, and continued at this pace till she came to the churchyard. Question: Was the gate open? Reply: Yes, monsieur, and this surprised me, but it did not seem to surprise Mademoiselle Day. Question: Was there no one in the churchyard? Reply: I did not see anyone, and if there had been, I must have seen him. The moon was shining on the snow and made the night quite light. Question: Are you superstitious? Reply: No, monsieur. I am a practicing Catholic. Question: In what condition of mind were you? Reply: Very sane, I assure you. Mademoiselle Day's curious action in going out at that hour worried me at first, but as soon as I saw her go to the churchyard, I thought that she meant to fulfill some pious duty on her father's grave. She knelt down by the grave and began to pray. At that moment it struck midnight. At the last stroke I saw her lift her eyes to the sky and stretch out her arms as though in ecstasy. I was wondering what the reason could be when I myself raised my head, and everything within me seemed drawn towards the unseen, which was playing the most perfect music. Christine and I knew that music. We'd heard it as children, but it had never been executed with such divine art, not even by her father. I remembered the story that Christine had told me about her angel of music. Her father used to say that when he died, he would send his angel of music to protect her. If Christine's angel had existed, he could not have played more beautifully that night. When the music stopped, I seemed to hear a noise from the heap of bones. It was as though they were laughing, and I could not help shuddering. Question: did it not occur to you that the musician might be hiding behind that very heap of bones? Reply: it was the one thought that did occur to me, monsieur, so much so that I omitted to follow Mademoiselle Day when she stood up and walked slowly to the gate. She was so much absorbed just then that I'm not surprised that she didn't see me. Question: then what happened that you were found in the morning lying half dead on the steps of the high altar? Reply: first, a skull rolled to my feet, then another, and suddenly I saw a shadow glide along the sacristy wall. I ran up. The shadow had already pushed open the door and entered the church, but I was quicker than the shadow and caught hold of a corner of its cloak. At that moment we were just in front of the high altar, and the moonlight fell straight upon us through the stained glass windows of the apse. As I did not let go of the cloak, the shadow turned round, and I saw a terrible death's head which stared at me with a pair of scorching eyes. I felt as if I were face to face with Satan, and in the presence of this unearthly apparition my heart gave way. My courage failed me, and I remember nothing more until I recovered consciousness at the setting sun. The next Saturday morning, on reaching their office, the joint managers found a letter from O.G., which said, "My dear managers, so it is to be war between us. If you still care for peace, here is my ultimatum. It consists of the 4 following conditions. 1. You must give me back my private box, and I shall expect to have it at my free disposal from this day forward. 2. The part of Margarita shall be sung tonight by Christine Day. Never mind about Carlotta. She will be ill. 3. I absolutely insist upon the good and loyal services of Madame Giry, my box-keeper. 4. Let me know by a letter handed to Madame Giry, who will see that it reaches me, that you accept, as did your predecessors, the terms of the lease relating to my monthly allowance. I will inform you later how you are to pay it to me. If you refuse, you will give Faust tonight in a house with a curse upon it. Take my advice and be warned in time. O.G." That night, the first act passed without incident. When Christine entered the stage, she raised her head and saw the Vicomte de Chagny in his box. From that moment, her voice seemed less sure, less crystal clear than usual. "What a queer girl she is," said one of Carlotta's friends. "The other day she was divine, and today she can't sing a note." In the beginning of the third act, Carlotta made her entrance, and, certain of herself and her success, she flung herself into her part without the least modesty or restraint. She was applauded all the more, and her duet with Faust seemed to bring her a new success, when suddenly a terrible thing happened. Just as she sang, "Oh, how strange, like a spell does the evening bind me," Carlotta's voice fell, and she croaked like a toad. There was consternation on Carlotta's face, and on the faces of all the audience. The uproar in the house was indescribable. If the thing had happened to anyone but Carlotta, she would have been hooted. But everyone knew how perfect her voice was, and there was no display of anger, but only horror and dismay. Meanwhile, in box 5, Moncharmin and Richard had turned very pale. Leaning over the ledge in their box, they stared at Carlotta as though they didn't recognize her. The ghost had told them it would come. The house had a curse upon it. Richard was calling to Carlotta in a smothered voice. "Well, go on!" Bravely she started afresh on the fatal line at the end of which the toad had appeared. An awful silence succeeded the uproar. Again Carlotta's voice filled the house. "I feel without alarm." The toad also had started afresh. The house broke into a wild tumult. The two managers collapsed in their chairs and dared not even turn round. They had not the strength, for the ghost was chuckling behind their backs. They distinctly heard his mouthless voice saying in their ears, "Tonight her singing will bring the chandelier down." They raised their eyes to the ceiling and cried out in horror. The chandelier, the immense mass of the chandelier, was slipping down, coming towards them at the call of that fiendish voice. Released from its hook, it plunged from the ceiling and came smashing into the middle of the stalls, amid 1,000 shouts of terror and a wild rush for the doors. The papers of the day state that there were numbers wounded and 1 killed. The chandelier had crashed down upon the head of a wretched woman who had come to the opera for the first time in her life, the woman whom Monsieur Richard had appointed to succeed Madame Giry, the ghost's box-keeper. That tragic evening was a bad one for all concerned. Carlotta fell ill. As for Christine Day, she disappeared after the performance and was not seen for a fortnight. Raoul was grief-stricken and told his brother everything that had occurred. The Count consoled him without asking for explanations and suggested taking him out to dinner. Overcome as he was with despair, Raoul would probably have refused any invitation that evening if the Count had not, as an inducement, told him that the lady of his thoughts had been seen the night before with a man in the Bois. At first, the Viscount refused to believe it, but he was given such exact details that he ceased protesting. She had been seen driving in a brougham with the window down. There was full moon shining, and she was recognized beyond a doubt. As for her companion, only his shadowy outline was seen, leaning back in the darkness. The carriage was going at a walking pace down a lonely drive behind the grandstand at Longchamp. Raoul dressed in frantic haste, prepared to forget his distress in flinging himself into the vortex of pleasure. Alas, he was but a dull guest, and leaving his brother early, found himself by 10 o'clock in the evening in a cab behind the Longchamp racecourse. It was freezing hard. The road lay deserted and very bright under the moonlight. He told the driver to wait for him at the corner of an avenue, and hiding as best he could, stood stamping his feet to keep warm. He had remained like this for half an hour or so, when a carriage turned into the road and came quietly in his direction at a walking pace. As it approached, he saw that a woman was leaning her head from the window, and suddenly the moon shed a pale gleam over her features. "Christine!" The sacred name of his love had sprung from his heart, but the next minute he would have given anything to withdraw it, for his call threw Christine into confusion. The window was raised, and the carriage dashed past him before he could leap in front of the horses' heads. In a moment, the brougham was no more than a black spot on the white road. When his valet brought his letters the next morning, he found Raoul sitting on his bed. He had not undressed, and at the sight of his face the servant feared that some disaster had occurred. Raoul snatched the letters from the man's hands. He recognized Christine's paper and handwriting. The envelope was covered with mud and unstamped. It bore the words, "To be handed to Monsieur le Vicomte Raoul de Chagny," with the address in pencil. It must have been flung out in the hope that a passer-by would pick up the note and deliver it, which was what happened. The note had been picked up on the pavement of the Place de l'Opéra. "My dear, go to the masked ball at the opera on the night after tomorrow. At 12 o'clock, be in the little room behind the chimney-piece of the big room. Stand near the door that leads to the rotunda. Don't mention this appointment to a living soul. Wear a white domino and see that you are well masked. If you love me, do not let yourself be recognized. Christine." The hour of the appointment came at last. With his face in a mask trimmed with long, thick lace, looking very foolish in his white wrap, the Viscount thought himself most ridiculous. Men of the world do not go to the opera ball in fancy dress. It was laughable. One thought, however, consoled the Viscount. he would certainly never be recognized. This ball was an exceptional affair, given some little time before Shrovetide, and it was expected to be much gayer, noisier, and more bohemian than the ordinary masked ball. Numbers of artists had arranged to go, accompanied by a whole cohort of models and pupils, and by midnight they were creating a tremendous din. Raoul arrived at 5 minutes to 12, but did not linger to look at the motley dresses displayed all the way up the marble staircase, replied to no one, and shook off the bold familiarity of a number of couples who had already become a trifle too gay. Crossing the big room and escaping from a mad whirl of dancers in which he was momentarily caught, he at last entered the room mentioned in Christina's letter. He found it crammed, for this small space was the point where all those who were going to supper in the rotunda converged with those who were returning, and here the fun waxed fast and furious. Raoul leant against a doorpost and waited. He did not wait long. A black domino passed and made him a sign with her hand. He understood that it was she and followed her. "Is that you, Christine?" he asked between his teeth. The black domino turned round promptly and raised her finger to her lips, no doubt to warn him not to mention her name again. Raoul continued to follow her in silence. The black domino turned back from time to time to see if he was still following. As Raoul once more passed through the great room, this time in the wake of his guide, he could not help noticing a group crowding round a person whose disguise, eccentric air, and cadaverous appearance were causing a sensation. It was a man dressed all in scarlet, with a huge hat and feathers on the top of a wonderful death's head. From his shoulders hung an immense red velvet cloak which trailed along the floor like a king's train, and on this cloak was embroidered in gold letters, which everyone read and repeated aloud, "Touch me not, I am Red Death." Then one, greatly daring, did try to touch him, but a skeleton hand shot out of a crimson sleeve and violently seized the rash one's wrist, and he, feeling the knuckle-bone clutch of death, uttered a cry of pain and terror. When Red Death released him at last, he ran away like a madman, pursued by the jeers of the bystanders. It was at this moment that Raoul passed in front of the funereal masquerader, who had just happened to turn in his direction, and he nearly exclaimed, "The death's head of Perros-Guirec!" He had recognized him. He wanted to dart forward, forgetting Christine, but the black domino, who also seemed a prey to some strange excitement, caught him by the arm and dragged him from the room, far from the mad crowd through which Red Death was stalking. The black domino kept on looking back, and on 2 occasions apparently saw something that startled her, for she hurried her pace and Raoul's as though they were being pursued. They went up 2 floors. Here the stairs and corridors were almost deserted. The black domino opened the door of a private box and beckoned Raoul to follow her. Then Christine, whom he now knew by the sound of her voice, closed the door behind them and warned him in a whisper to remain at the back of the box and on no account to show himself. Raoul took off his mask. Christine kept on hers, and when Raoul was about to ask her to remove it, he was surprised to see her put her ear to the partition and listen eagerly for a sound outside. Then she opened the door ajar, looked out into the corridor, and in a low voice said, "He must have gone up higher." Suddenly she exclaimed, "He is coming down again." She tried to close the door, but Raoul prevented her, for he had seen on the top step of the staircase that led to the floor above a red foot, followed by another, and slowly, majestically, the whole scarlet dress of Red Death met his eyes, and he once more saw the death's head of Perros-Guirec. "It's he!" he exclaimed. "This time he shall not escape me!" But Christine had slammed the door at the moment when Raoul was on the point of rushing out. He tried to push her aside. "Who do you mean?" she asked in a changed voice. "Who shall not escape you?" Raoul tried to overcome the girl's resistance by force, but she repelled him with a strength which he would not have suspected in her. He understood, or thought he understood, and at once lost his temper. "Who?" he repeated angrily. "Why, he, the man who hides behind that hideous mask of death, the evil genius of the churchyard at Perros, Red Death, in a word, Madame, your friend, your angel of music. But I shall snatch off his mask as I shall snatch off my own, and this time we shall look each other in the face, with no veil and no lies between us, and I shall know whom you love and who loves you." He burst into a mad laugh, while Christine gave a disconsolate moan behind her velvet mask. With a tragic gesture, she flung herself against the door. "In the name of our love, Raoul, you shall not pass." He stopped. What had she said? In the name of their love? Never before had she confessed that she loved him, and yet she had had opportunities enough. She wished to give the Red Death time to escape. And in accents of childish hatred he cried, "You lie, madame, for you do not love me, and you have never loved me. What a poor fellow I must be to let you mock and flout me as you have done. Why did you give me every reason for hope at Perros? For honest hope, madame, for I am an honest man, and I believed you to be an honest woman, when your only intention was to deceive me. You have taken a shameful advantage of the candid affection of your benefactress herself, who continues to believe in your sincerity, while you go about the opera ball with Red Death. I despise you." And he burst into tears. She allowed him to insult her. She thought of but one thing to prevent him from leaving the box. "You will beg my pardon one day for all those ugly words, Raoul, and I shall forgive you." He shook his head. "No, no, you have driven me mad. When I think that I had only one object in life, to give my name to an opera wench. Raoul, how can you? I shall die of shame." "No, dear, live," said Christine in a grave and breaking voice, "and goodbye." "Goodbye, Raoul." The boy stepped towards her, risking one more sarcasm. "Oh, but you must let me come and applaud you from time to time." "I shall never sing again, Raoul." "Really?" he replied, still more sarcastically. "So he is taking you off the stage. I congratulate you. But shall we meet in the Bois one of these evenings?" "Not in the Bois, nor anywhere, Raoul. You shall not see me again." "May one at least ask to what darkness you are returning? For what hell are you leaving, mysterious lady? Or for what paradise?" "I came to tell you, dear, but I cannot tell you now. You would not believe me. You have lost faith in me, Raoul. It is finished." She spoke in such a despairing voice that the young man began to feel remorse for his cruelty. "But can't you tell me what all this means?" he cried. "You are free. Explain yourself, Christine, I beg of you." Christine simply took off her mask and said, "My dear, it is a tragedy." Raoul now saw her face, and could not restrain an exclamation of surprise and terror. The fresh complexion of former days was gone. A mortal pallor covered those features which he had known so charming and so gentle, and sorrow had traced dark and unspeakably sad shadows under her eyes. "My dearest," he moaned, holding out his arms, "you promised to forgive me." "Perhaps, some day, perhaps," she said, resuming her mask, and she went away, forbidding him with a gesture to follow her. He tried to disobey her, but she turned round and repeated her gesture of farewell with such authority that he dared not move a step. He watched her till she was out of sight. Then he also went down among the crowd with an aching heart. His footsteps took him to that room where he had first known suffering. He tapped at the door. There was no answer. He entered, as he had that night when he looked everywhere for the man's voice. The room was empty. A gas jet was burning, turned down, low. He saw some letter paper on a little desk. He thought of writing to Christine, but he heard steps in the passage. He only just had time to hide in the inner room, which was separated from the dressing-room by a curtain. Christine entered, took off her mask with a weary gesture, and flung it on the table. She sighed and let her pretty head fall into her two hands. What was she thinking of? Of Raoul? No, for Raoul heard her murmur, "Poor Eric." What had this Eric to do with Christine's sighs, and why was she pitying Eric when Raoul was so unhappy? Christine began to write, deliberately and calmly, filling 2, 3, 4 sheets. Suddenly, she raised her head and hid the sheets in her bodice. She seemed to be listening. Raoul also listened. Whence came that strange sound, that distant rhythm? A faint singing seemed to issue from the walls. The song became plainer. Now the words were distinguishable. He heard a voice, a very beautiful, very soft, very captivating voice, which came nearer and nearer. It came through the wall, and now it was in the room, in front of Christine. Christine rose and addressed the voice as though speaking to someone beside her. "Here I am, Eric," she said. "I am ready, but you are late." Raoul, peeping from behind the curtain, could not believe his eyes, for they showed him nothing. Christine's face lit up. A smile of happiness appeared upon her bloodless lips, a smile like that of sick people when they receive the first hope of recovery. The voice was singing the wedding night song from Romeo and Juliet. Raoul saw Christine stretch out her arms to the voice as he had done in the churchyard at Perrault, to the invisible violin playing the resurrection of Lazarus, and nothing could describe the passion with which the voice sang, "Fate links thee to me for ever and a day." The strains went through Raoul's heart. He managed to draw back the curtain that hid him and walked to where Christine stood. She herself was moving to the back of the room, the whole wall of which was occupied by a great mirror that reflected her image, but not his, for he was just behind and entirely concealed by her. Christine walked towards her image in the glass, and the image came towards her. The two Christines, the real one and the reflection, touched, and Raoul put out his arms to clasp the two in one embrace. But all of a sudden, in a dazzle of light that sent him staggering, Raoul was suddenly flung back. An icy blast swept across his face, and he saw not 2, but 4, 8, 20 Christines spinning round him, laughing at him, and fleeing so swiftly that he could not touch one of them. At last, everything stood still again, and he saw himself in the glass. But Christine had disappeared. The day after Christine had vanished before his eyes, Raoul called to see Madame Valerius. Christine herself was seated by the old lady's bedside, and the latter was sitting up against her pillows, knitting. The pink and white had returned to the young girl's cheeks. The dark rings round her eyes had disappeared. If a veil of melancholy had not lingered over those adorable features, the last trace of the weird drama in whose toils that mysterious child was struggling, he could have believed that Christine was not its heroine at all. She rose, without showing any emotion, and offered him her hand. But Raoul's stupefaction was so great that he stood there dumbfounded, without saying a word. "Well, Monsieur de Chagny," exclaimed Madame Valerius, "don't you know our Christine? Her good fairy has sent her back to us." "Mamma," the girl broke in promptly, "you know there is no such thing as the angel of music. I promised to explain everything to you one of these days, and I hope to do so, but you promised me until that day to be silent, and to ask me no more questions ever. Provided that you promised never to leave me again. But have you promised that, Christine?" "Mamma, all this cannot interest Monsieur de Chagny." "On the contrary, mademoiselle," said the young man in a voice which he tried to make firm and brave, but which still trembled. "Anything that concerns you interests me to an extent which perhaps you will one day understand. After what happened between us yesterday, I hardly expected to see you here so soon. And I have been your friend too long not to be alarmed at a disastrous adventure which will remain dangerous until we have unravelled its threads, and which will certainly end by making you its victim, Christine." "What does this mean?" cried Madame Valerius. "Is Christine in danger?" "Yes, madame," said Raoul. "There is a terrible mystery which concerns you and Christine." "Don't believe him, mamma," Christine implored. "Then tell me that you will never leave me again," begged her mother. Christine was silent, and Raoul said, "That is what you must promise, Christine." "That is a promise which I refuse to make," said the young girl haughtily. "I am mistress of my own actions, Monsieur de Chagny. You have no right to control them, and I will beg you to desist henceforth. As to what I have done during the last fortnight, there is only one man in the world who has the right to demand an account of me, my husband. Well, I have no husband, and I mean never to marry." She threw out her hands to emphasize her words, and Raoul turned pale, because he had caught sight of a plain gold ring on Christine's finger. "You have no husband, and yet you wear a wedding ring." He tried to seize her hand, but she swiftly drew it back. "That's a present," she said, blushing once more and vainly striving to hide her embarrassment. "Christine, as you have no husband, that ring can only have been given by one who hopes to make you his wife. Why deceive us further? That ring is a promise, and that promise has been accepted." "That's what I said," exclaimed the old lady. "And what did she answer, madame?" "What I chose," said Christine, driven to exasperation. "Don't you think, monsieur, that this cross-examination has lasted long enough?" "I beg your pardon for speaking as I did, mademoiselle, but allow me to tell you what I have seen." "Well, what did you see, sir?" "I saw your ecstasy at the sound of the voice, Christine, the voice that came through the wall, and that is what makes me so afraid for you. I believe you are under a very dangerous spell." Raoul spoke with so much love and despair in his voice that Christine could not keep back a sob. She took his hands and looked at him with all the pure affection of which she was capable. "Raoul," she pleaded urgently, "forget that voice. You must never try to fathom the mystery." "Is it so terrible?" "There is no more awful mystery on this earth. Swear to me that you will make no attempt to find out. Swear to me that you will never come to my dressing-room again, unless I send for you." "Then you promise to send for me sometimes, Christine?" "I promise." "When?" "Tomorrow." "Then I swear to do as you ask." He kissed her hands and went away, cursing Eric and resolving to be patient. The next day he saw her at the opera. She was still wearing the plain gold ring. She was gentle and kind to him. She talked to him of the plans which he was forming, of his future, of his career. He told her that the date of his next voyage had been put forward, and that he would leave France in 3 weeks or a month at latest. She suggested that he must look upon the voyage with delight as a stage towards his coming fame, and when he replied that fame without love was no attraction in his eyes, she treated him as a child whose sorrows were but short-lived. She seemed to be thinking of some new thing that had entered her mind for the first time. Her eyes were all aglow with it. "What are you thinking of, Christine?" "I'm thinking that we shall not see each other again." "And does that make you radiant?"
"And that in a month we shall have to say goodbye forever."
"Unless, Christine, we pledge our faith and wait for each other forever."
She put her hand on his mouth. "Hush, Raoul. You know there is no question of that. And we shall never be married, that is understood. But if we cannot be married, we can be engaged. No one will know but ourselves, Raoul. We can be engaged, dear, for a month. In a month you will go away, and I can be happy at the thought of that month all my life long." She was enchanted with her inspiration, and Raoul jumped at the idea. He bowed to Christine and said, "Mademoiselle, I have the honor to ask for your hand." "Why, you have both of them already, my dear betrothed." "Oh, Raoul, how happy we shall be. We must play at being engaged from morning till night. It was the most wonderful game in the world, and they enjoyed it like the children they were. They played at hearts, as other children might play at ball, only as it was really their two hearts that they flung to and fro, they had to be very careful to catch them each time without hurting them. Christine returned to the opera in triumph. She renewed her extraordinary success of the gala performance. Since the toad incident, Carlotta had not been able to appear on the stage. The terror of a fresh, cracked note filled her heart and deprived her of all her power of singing, and the theatre that had witnessed her incomprehensible disgrace had become odious to her. She contrived to cancel her contract. Christine was offered the vacant place for the time being. The Viscount, who was of course present, was the only one to suffer on hearing the 1,000 echoes of this fresh triumph, for Christine still wore her plain gold ring. A distant voice whispered in his ear, "She is wearing the ring again tonight, and you did not give it to her. She gave her soul again tonight, and did not give it to you. If she will not tell you what she has been doing these last 2 days, you must go and ask Eric." He ran behind the scenes and placed himself in her way. "I will remove you from his power, Christine, I swear it, and you shall not think of him any more." Is it possible? She allowed herself the doubt, the encouragement, and she drew the young man up to the topmost floor of the theatre, far, far from the trapdoors. "I shall hide you in some unknown corner of the world where he cannot come to look for you. You will be safe, and then I shall go away, as you have sworn never to marry." Christine seized Raoul's hands and squeezed them rapturously, but suddenly alarmed, she turned away her head. "Higher," was all she said. "Higher still." And she dragged him up towards the topmost floor of the building. He had difficulty in following her. They were soon under the roof. In the maze of timber-work, they slipped through the buttresses and the rafters. They ran from beam to beam as they might have run from tree to tree in a forest. And despite the care which she took to look behind her at every moment, she failed to see a shadow which followed her like her own shadow, which stopped when she stopped, which started again when she did, and made no more noise than a well-conducted shadow should. They reached the roof, and the shadow had followed behind them, clinging to every step. They little suspected its presence when they at last sat down, trustingly, under the mighty protection of Apollo, who with a sweep of his bronze arm lifted his huge lyre to the heart of a crimson sky. Christine said, "Soon we shall go farther and faster than the clouds, to the end of the world, and then you will leave me, Raoul. But if, when the moment comes for you to take me away, I refuse to go with you, you must carry me off by force." "Are you afraid that you will change your mind, Christine?" "I don't know," she said, shaking her head. "He is a demon." And she shivered and nestled in Raoul's arms with a moan. "I am afraid now of going back to live with him in the ground." "But what compels you to go back, Christine?" he asked frantically. "If I do not go back to him, terrible misfortunes may happen. I have only a day left, and if I do not go, he will drag me down with him and go on his knees before me. He will tell me that he loves me, and he will cry. Oh, those tears, Raoul! I cannot bear to see those tears flow again." She wrung her hands in anguish, while Raoul pressed her to his heart. "No, no, you shall never again hear him tell you that he loves you, or see his tears. We must leave at once, Christine." And he tried to drag her away then and there, but she stopped him. "No, no," she said, shaking her head sadly. "Not now. It would be too cruel. Let him hear me sing tomorrow evening, and then we will go away. You must come and fetch me in my dressing-room at midnight exactly. He will be waiting for me in the dining-room by the lake. We shall be free, and you shall take me away. You must promise me that, Raoul, even if I refuse, for I feel that if I go back this time I shall never return." And she gave a sigh which seemed to be echoed by another sigh behind her. "Did you hear that?"
"No,"
said Raoul.
"I heard nothing."
"It is too terrible to be always trembling like this, and yet we run no danger here. We are at home in the open air, in the light. The sun is flaming, and night birds cannot bear to look at the sun. I have never seen him by daylight. It must be awful. Oh, the first time I saw him I thought I would die. I heard his voice for 3 months without seeing him. The first time I thought as you did, that the angelic voice was singing in another room. I went out and looked everywhere, but I could not find the voice outside my room, though it went on steadily inside. And it not only sang, but it spoke to me and answered my questions like a real man's voice. I had never forgotten the angel of music whom my poor father had promised to send to me as soon as he was dead. I really think that Mamma was a little bit to blame. I told her about it, and she at once said, 'It must be the angel. At any rate you can do no harm by asking him.' I did so, and the man's voice replied that yes, it was the angel's voice, the voice which I was expecting and which my father had promised me. From that time onward, the voice and I became great friends. It asked if it could give me lessons every day. You have no idea, though you have heard the voice, of what those lessons were like. We were accompanied by a music which I had never heard before. It was behind the wall and wonderfully accurate. The voice seemed to understand mine exactly. One day it said, 'Wait and see, we shall conquer Paris.' And I lived on in a sort of ecstatic dream. It was then that I saw you for the first time one evening in the audience. I was so glad to see you again that I never thought of concealing my delight when I reached my dressing-room. Unfortunately, the voice was there before me and soon noticed that something had happened. It asked what was the matter, and I saw no reason for keeping our story secret or concealing the place which you filled in my heart. Then the voice was silent. I called to it, but it did not reply. I begged and entreated, but in vain. I was terrified lest it had gone for good. I wished to heaven it had, dearest. That night I went home feeling desperate. I told Mamma, who said, 'Why, of course, the voice is jealous.' And that, dear, first revealed to me that I loved you." Christine stopped and laid her head on Raoul's shoulder. They sat like that for a moment in silence, and they did not see a few steps away from them the creeping shadow of 2 great black wings, a shadow that came along the roof so near that it could have stifled them with one gesture. "The next day," continued Christine with a sigh, "I went back to my dressing-room, and the voice was there. It told me plainly that if I must bestow my heart on earth, there was nothing for it to do but to go back to heaven. And it said this with such an accent of human sorrow that I ought then and there to have suspected and begun to believe that I was the victim of my deluded senses. But my faith in the voice with which the memory of my father was so closely mingled remained undisturbed. I feared nothing so much as that I might never hear it again. I had thought about my love for you and realized how useless it was. Whatever happened, your position in society forbade me to contemplate the possibility of ever marrying you, and I swore to the voice that you were no more to me than a brother, nor ever would be, and that my heart was incapable of any earthly love. And that, dear, was why I refused to recognize or see you when I met you on the stage or in the passages. I don't know how it was that Carlotta did not come to the theatre that night, nor why I was called upon to sing in her stead, but I sang with a rapture I had never felt before, and I felt for a moment as if my soul were leaving my body. Then I felt myself fainting. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them, you were by my side, but the voice was there also, Raoul. It said that if I did not love you, I would not avoid you, but treat you like any other friend. At last I said to the voice, "That will do. I am going to Perrault tomorrow to pray on my father's grave, and I shall ask Monsieur Raoul de Chagny to go with me." "Do as you please," replied the voice, "but I shall be at Perrault too, for I am wherever you are, Christine." "But why did you not get rid of the nightmare once you knew the truth about him?" Raoul begged her. "Know the truth, Raoul? But I was not caught in the nightmare until the day when I learned the truth. Do you remember that terrible evening when the chandelier crashed to the floor of the opera house? The voice had told me that it would be at the performance, and I was really afraid for it, just as if it had been an ordinary person. I thought that if it was safe, it would be sure to be in my dressing-room, so I went there immediately. Suddenly, I heard a long, beautiful wail, and recognized it to be the music which you and I had heard at Perrault. Then the voice began to sing. 'Come and believe me. Whoso believes in me shall never die.' I cannot tell you the effect which that music had upon me. It seemed to command me personally to come to it, and I followed. There was a mirror in front of me, and suddenly I was outside the room without knowing how. I was in a dark passage, and I saw a faint red glimmer in a distant angle of the wall. I cried out. My voice was the only sound, for the singing and the violin had stopped, and then I felt a hand on mine, or rather a stone-cold, bony thing that seized my wrist and did not let go. I struggled for a little while and then gave up. I was dragged towards the little red light, and then I saw that I was in the hands of a man wrapped in a large cloak and wearing a mask that hid his whole face. I made one last effort. I opened my mouth to scream, but a hand closed it, a hand that smelt of death. Then I fainted. When I opened my eyes, we were still surrounded by darkness. We were on the edge of a lake whose leaden waters stretched into the darkness. The red light lit up the bank, and I saw a little boat fastened to an iron ring on the wharf. The man lifted me into the boat, jumped in, and seized the oars. He rowed with a quick, powerful stroke, and his eyes, under the mask, never left me. We slipped across the noiseless water in the red light. Then we were in the dark again as we touched the shore, and I was once more taken up in the man's arms. I cried aloud. Then there was a dazzling light, and I found myself in the middle of a drawing-room, which seemed to be decorated with nothing but flowers, cut flowers, magnificent because of the silk ribbons that tied them into their baskets. They were much too elegant, like those which I used to find in my dressing-room after a first night. And in the midst of all these flowers stood the black shape of the man in the mask, who said, "Don't be afraid, Christine. You are in no danger." It was the voice. I rushed at the mask and tried to snatch it away so as to see the face of the voice, but it backed away and said, "You are in no danger, so long as you do not touch the mask." Taking me gently by the wrists, he forced me into a chair, then went down on his knees before me. I felt that this was some terrible eccentric person who had mysteriously succeeded in taking up his abode there, under the cellars of the opera house, and the voice which was on its knees before me was a man. I began to cry. The man, still kneeling, must have understood the cause of my tears, for he said, "It is true, Christine. I am not an angel, nor a genius, nor a ghost. I am Eric." Christine's narrative was again interrupted. An echo behind them seemed to repeat the word after her. "Eric." They both turned round and saw that night had fallen. Raoul made a movement as though to rise, but Christine pulled him back. "Don't go," she said. "I want you to know everything here." But why here, Christine? Because we are safe here. But, Christine, something tells me that we are wrong to wait till tomorrow evening, and that we ought to fly at once. I tell you that if he does not hear me sing tomorrow, it will cause him infinite pain. Does he love you so much? He would commit murder for me. Then why, when you were able to run away, did you go back to him? Because I had to. And you will understand that when I tell you how I left him. Oh, I hate him, cried Raoul. And you, Christine, tell me, do you hate him too? No, said Christine simply. He fills me with horror, but I do not hate him. How can I hate him, Raoul? Think of Eric at my feet, in the house on the lake, underground. He lays at my feet an immense and tragic love. He has imprisoned me with him underground for love, but he respects me. And when I stood up, Raoul, and told him that I could only despise him if he did not give me my liberty, he offered it. Then he sang to me, and I listened and stayed. That night we did not exchange another word. He sang me to sleep. When I woke up, I was alone, lying on a sofa in a simply furnished little bedroom. I soon discovered that I was a prisoner. I saw on the chest of drawers a note in red ink which said, "My dear Christine, you do not need to be afraid. You have no better, no more respectful friend in the world than myself. You are at home here." I felt sure that I had fallen into the hands of a madman. I ran round the room looking for a way of escape, but could not find one. I was completely alone in the silence when I heard 3 taps against the wall. Eric walked in through a door which I had not noticed, and which he left open. His arms were full of boxes and parcels, and he arranged them on the bed while I shouted at him and called upon him to take off his mask if it covered the face of an honest man. He replied, "You shall never see Eric's face." Then he said he loved me, but that he would never tell me so except when I gave him leave, and that the rest of the time would be spent in music. "What do you mean by the rest of time?" I asked. 5 days, he replied. I asked him if I should then be free, and he said, "You will be free, Christine. For when those 5 days are past, you will have learned not to fear me, and then you will come back to see your poor Eric." He said he would like to show me over his home, and he opened a door before me. "This is my room, if you care to see it. It is rather curious." I felt as if I were entering a mortuary chamber. The walls were all hung with black. In the middle of the room was a canopy, hung with red brocade curtains, and under the canopy an open coffin. "That is where I sleep," said Eric. "One has to get used to everything in life, even to eternity." The sight upset me so much that I turned away my head. Then I saw the keyboard of an organ which filled one whole side of the wall. On the desk was a music book covered with red notes. I asked leave to look at it, and on the first page read, "Don Juan, triumphant." "Yes," he said, "I compose sometimes. I began that work 20 years ago. When I have finished, I shall take it away with me in that coffin and never wake up again." "You must work at it as seldom as you can," I said. He replied, "I sometimes work at it for 14 days and nights together, during which I live on music only, and then I rest for years at a time." "Will you play me something out of your Don Juan Triumphant?" I asked, thinking to please him. "You must never ask me that," he said in a gloomy voice. "I will play you Mozart if you like, but my Don Juan burns, Christine. You see, there is some music so terrible that it consumes all who approach it. Fortunately, you have not come to that music yet, for you would lose all your pretty colouring, and nobody would know you when you returned to Paris. Let us sing something operatic." He spoke these last words as though he were flinging an insult at me. We at once began the duet in Othello, and I sang Desdemona with a despair, a terror which I had never displayed before. As for him, his voice thundered forth his vengeful soul at every note. Love, jealousy, hatred burst out around us in harrowing cries. Eric was Othello himself. Suddenly, I wanted desperately to see beneath the mask. I wanted to know the face of the voice, and with a movement which I was utterly unable to control, my fingers swiftly tore away the mask. Oh, horror, horror, horror! If I live to be 100, I shall never forget the superhuman cry of grief and rage which he uttered when the terrible sight appeared before my eyes. Raoul, you have seen death's heads when they have been dried and withered by the years, and perhaps you saw his death's head at Perrault, and then you saw Red Death stalking about at the last masked ball. But all those death's heads were motionless, and their dumb sorrow was not alive. But imagine, if you can, Red Death's mask suddenly coming to life in order to express, with the 4 black holes of its eyes, its nose, and its mouth, the mighty fury of a demon, and not a ray of light from the sockets, for, as I learned later, you cannot see his blazing eyes except in the dark. I fell back against the wall, and he came to me, grinding his teeth hideously, and as I fell upon my knees, he hissed mad, incoherent words and curses at me. Leaning over me, he cried, "Look, do you want to see? Feast your eyes and your soul on my cursed ugliness. Look at Eric's face. Are you satisfied? I am a good-looking fellow, eh? When a woman has seen me, she belongs to me. She loves me forever. I am a kind of Don Juan, you know." And drawing himself up to his full height, with his hands on his hips, wagging the hideous thing that was his head on his shoulders, he roared, "Look at me! I am Don Juan, triumphant!" And when I turned away my head and begged for mercy, he drew my head back to him brutally, twisting his dead fingers into my hair. "Enough, enough!" cried Raoul. "I will kill him! In heaven's name, Christine, tell me where he is! I must kill him!" "Oh, Raoul, listen, listen! He dragged me by my hair, and then, oh, it is too horrible!" Well, what? Out with it!" exclaimed Raoul fiercely. Then Eric hissed at me. "Ah, I frighten you, do I? Perhaps you think that I have another mask, eh? And that this head is a mask? Well," he roared, "tear it off as you did the other. I insist. Give me your hands." And he seized my hands and dug them into his awful face. He tore his flesh with my nails, his terrible dead flesh. "No," he shouted, "that it is a corpse that loves you and adores you, and will never, never leave you. Look, I am not laughing now. I'm crying for you, Christine, who have torn off my mask, and who therefore can never leave me again. As long as you thought I was handsome, you could have come back. I know you would have come back, but now that you know my hideousness, you would run away for good. So I must keep you here. Oh, mad Christine, who wanted to see me!" He had let go of me at last and was sobbing dreadfully. Then he disappeared into his room, closed the door, and left me alone again. Presently I heard the sound of the organ, and what he played was utterly different from what had charmed me up to then. His Don Juan triumphant, for I was sure that he had rushed to his masterpiece to forget the horror of the moment, seemed to me at first one long, agonizing, magnificent sob. But little by little I began to feel that it expressed every emotion, every suffering of which mankind is capable. It intoxicated me, and I opened the door that separated us. Eric rose as I entered, but dared not turn in my direction. "Eric!" I cried, "show me your face without fear. I swear that you are the most unhappy and sublime of men, and if I ever again tremble when I see your face, it will be because I am thinking of the splendor of your genius." Then Eric turned round, for he believed me. He fell at my feet with words of love in his dead mouth. What more can I tell you, dear? This went on for a fortnight during which I lied to him. My lies were as hideous as the monster who inspired them, but they were the price of my liberty. Gradually, I gave him such confidence that he ventured to take me walking on the banks of the lake and to row me in the boat. Towards the end of my captivity, he let me out through the gates that closed the underground passages in the Rue Scribe. Here a carriage awaited us and took us to the Bois. The night when we met you was nearly fatal to me, for he is terribly jealous of you, and I had to tell him that you were soon going away. At last, after a fortnight during which I was filled with pity, enthusiasm, despair, and horror by turns, he believed me when I told him I would come back.
"And you went back, Christine?"
groaned Raoul. "Yes, dear. And I must tell you that it was not his frightful threats when setting me free that helped me to keep my word, but his terrible unhappiness which bound me to him more than I realized when I left him. Poor Eric."
"Christine," said Raoul, rising, "you tell me that you love me, but you were free for only a few hours when you returned to Eric. Remember the masked ball."
"Yes, but remember also that those few hours I spent with you, Raoul, were dangerous for both of us."
"I doubted your love for me during those hours."
"Do you doubt it still, Raoul? Then know that each of my visits to Eric increased my horror of him, for each time I saw him it seemed to drive him mad with love, and I am so frightened, so frightened."
"You are frightened, but do you love me? If Eric were good-looking, would you love me, Christine?"
She rose in her turn, threw her two trembling arms round the young man's neck, and said, "Oh, my dearest Raoul, if I did not love you, I would not give you my lips. Take them for the first time and the last." They heard a low moan, which seemed to come from far away, and then rose in volume until the night was suddenly rent asunder with Eric's rage. They fled, but before they disappeared they saw high above them, astride Apollo's great statue, the outline of a huge night-bird that stared at them with its eyes blazing forth sparks of fire. Raoul and Christine ran, eager to escape from the roof and the blazing eyes that showed only in the dark, and they did not stop before they came to the 8th floor on the way down. There was no performance in the opera that night, and the passages were empty. Suddenly, a strange man appeared before them. "No, not this way," he said urgently. He pointed to another passage by which they were to reach the wings. Raoul wanted to stop and ask for an explanation, but the form, clad in a long frock coat and a pointed cap, said, "Quick, run quickly." Christine was already dragging Raoul away.
"Who is he? Who is that man?"
he asked. Christine replied, "It's the Persian."
"What's he doing here?"
"I don't know. He is always in the opera."
"You are making me run away for the first time in my life when I should have stayed. If that really was Eric we saw, I ought to have nailed him to Apollo's lyre."
"You are getting like me now," Christine warned, "seeing him everywhere. What we took for his blazing eyes was probably a couple of stars shining through the strings of the lyre." And Christine went down another floor, with Raoul following her.
"As you have quite made up your mind to go, Christine, I assure you it would be better to go at once. Why wait for tomorrow? He may have heard us tonight."
No, he is working, I tell you, at his Don Juan triumphant, and not thinking of us."
"Take care, Christine. You are making a ghost of him again.
No, he is not a ghost. He is a man of heaven and earth, that is all. A nice way to speak of him. And are you still resolved to run away from him? Yes, tomorrow. Tomorrow you will have no resolve left. Then, Raoul, you must run away with me in spite of myself. Is that understood? I shall be here at 12 tomorrow night. I shall keep my promise, whatever happens.
Raoul spent the next day in his preparations for their flight together. At 9 o'clock that evening, a carriage with the curtains drawn took its place in the rank on the rotunda side. In front of it were 3 broughams belonging respectively to Carlotta, who had suddenly returned to Paris, to Sorelli, and at the head of the rank to the Comte Philippe de Chagny. No one left the carriage. The coachman remained on his box, and the 3 other coachmen remained on theirs. A shadow in a long black coat moved along the pavement between the rotunda and the carriages, examined the carriage carefully, went up to the horses and the coachman, and then went away without saying a word. They were performing Faust, as it happened, to a splendid house. Christine Day met with a rather cold reception, as the audience found it difficult to accept a debutante in such a difficult part. The singer felt that the house was against her, and was confused by their attitude. As a result, she lost her self-assurance. She trembled. She felt on the verge of breakdown. In the front of the house, people remembered the catastrophe that had befallen Carlotta at the end of that act, and the historic cracked note which had momentarily interrupted her career in Paris. Just then, Carlotta made a sensational entrance in a box facing the stage. Poor Christine raised her eyes and recognized her rival. She thought she saw a sneer on her lips, and that saved her. She forgot everything in order to triumph once more. From that moment, the prima donna sang with all her heart and soul. She tried to surpass all that she had done up to that time, and she succeeded. But at the moment which was to have been her greatest triumph, when she sang with her angel's voice, "My spirit longs with thee to rest," the stage was suddenly plunged into darkness. It happened so quickly that the spectators hardly had time to realize what was going on, for when the lights immediately came on again, Christine Day was no longer there. Raoul's first thought, after Christine's fantastic disappearance, was to accuse Eric. He no longer doubted the almost supernatural powers of the man in this domain of the opera where he had set up his empire. Raoul rushed through the opera house in a mad fit of love and despair. "Where are you going so fast, Monsieur de Chagny?" asked a voice behind him. Raoul turned and recognized the Persian of the night before. He stopped short. "Who are you?" he cried in a feverish voice. "You know who I am. I am the Persian. I hope, Monsieur de Chagny, that you have not betrayed Eric's secret." "And why should I hesitate to betray that monster, sir?" Raoul rejoined haughtily, trying to shake off the stranger. "I hoped that you said nothing about Eric, sir, because Eric's secret is also Christine Day's, and to talk about one is to talk about the other." "Sir," said Raoul, becoming more and more impatient, "you seem to know about many things that interest me, but I have no time to listen to you. Once more, where are you going so fast? Can you not guess? To Christine Day's assistance. Then, sir, stay here, for Christine Day is here." "How do you know?" "I was at the performance, and I know that no one in the world but Eric could contrive an abduction like that. Oh, I recognize the monster's touch. Sir, I do not know what your intentions are, but can you do anything to help me find her?" "I think so, Monsieur de Chagny. That is why I spoke to you." And the Persian led him down passages which Raoul had never seen before, even with Christine. They arrived at Christine's dressing-room, and the Persian went straight to the very thin partition that separated the dressing-room from the room next to it. He listened, and then coughed loudly. There was a sound of someone moving in the next room, and a few seconds later there was a tap at the door. "Come in," said the Persian. A man entered, dressed in the same manner as the Persian. He took a case from under his coat, put it on the dressing-table, bowed, and went to the door. "Did no one see you come in, Darius?" "No, master." "Let no one see you go out." The servant glanced down the passage and swiftly disappeared. The Persian opened the case. It contained a pair of long pistols. "When Christine Day was carried off, I sent word to my servant to bring me these pistols. I have had them a long time, and they can be relied upon." "Do you mean to fight a duel?" "It will certainly be a duel which we shall have to fight," said the other, examining the priming of his pistols and handing him one. "But I do not understand why you are risking your life. You must certainly hate Eric." "No, monsieur, I do not hate him. If I hated him, he would long ago have ceased to do harm." "Has he done you harm?" "I have forgiven him the harm which he has done me." "I do not understand you. You treat him as a monster, you speak of his crimes, and yet I find in you the same inexplicable pity that I saw in Christine." The Persian did not reply. He fetched a stool and set it against the wall, facing the great mirror that filled the whole of the partition opposite. Then he climbed on the stool and seemed to be looking for something. "Ah," he said after a long search, "I have it." He pressed against a corner in the pattern of the paper, and then turned round and jumped off the stool. "In half a minute we shall be on his road." And crossing the whole length of the dressing-room, he felt the great mirror. No, it is not yielding yet. Bearing against the mirror after a short silence, he said, "It takes some time to release the counterbalance when you press on the spring from the inside of the room. It is different when you are behind the wall and can act directly on the counterbalance. Then the mirror turns at once." "It's not turning," said Raoul impatiently. "Oh, wait. You have time enough to be impatient, sir. The mechanism has obviously become rusty, or else the spring isn't working, unless it is something else," added the Persian anxiously. "What?" "He may simply have cut the cords of the counterbalance and blocked the whole apparatus." "Why should he? He doesn't know we are coming this way." "I dare say he suspects it, for he knows that I understand the system." "It's not turning. And Christine, sir, Christine!" The Persian said coldly, "We shall do all that is humanly possible to do, but he may stop us at the first step. He commands the walls, the doors, and the trapdoors. In my country he was known by a name which means the trapdoor lover." "But why do these walls obey him alone? He did not build them." "Yes, sir, that is just what he did do." Raoul looked at him in amazement, but the Persian made a sign for him to be silent and pointed to the glass. There was a sort of shivering reflection, and then all became stationary again. "You see, sir, but it is not turning. Let us take another road." "Tonight there is no other," declared the Persian in a sad voice. "Now look out and be ready to fire." He raised his pistol opposite the glass. Raoul imitated his movement. With his free arm the Persian drew the young man to his chest, and suddenly the mirror turned in a blinding daze of cross lights, hurling them from the full light into the deepest darkness. "Hold your hand high, ready to fire," repeated Raoul's companion quickly. The wall behind them closed again, and the two men stood motionless for a moment, holding their breaths. At last the Persian made a movement, and Raoul heard him drop to his knees and feel for something in the dark. He stood up, and Raoul saw that he had a lantern. The little red disc turned in every direction, and Raoul observed that the floor, the walls, and the ceiling were all made out of planking. This was Eric's secret route to reach Christine's dressing-room. It had been contrived at the time of the Paris Commune to allow the jailers to move their prisoners straight to the dungeons constructed for them in the cellars. The Persian went on his knees again and put his lantern on the ground. He seemed to be working at the floor. Suddenly he turned off his light. Then Raoul heard a faint click and saw a very pale luminous square in the floor of the passage. It was as though he had opened a window. "Follow me, and do all that I do." Raoul turned to the opening and saw his guide, who was still on his knees, then hang by his hands from the rim with his pistol between his teeth and slide into the cellar below. Raoul went on his knees also and hung from the trap with both hands. "Let go," said a voice.
he dropped into the arms of the Persian and found he was in the cellars. The cellars of the opera are enormous and 5 in number. Following the Persian, Raoul wondered what he would have done without him in that extraordinary labyrinth. They eventually arrived in the huge cellars directly below the stage. They must at this time have been at an extremely great depth, when we remember that the earth was dug out 50 feet below the water that lay under the whole of that part of Paris. Much water had to be removed in the building of the opera. The amount of water that was pumped up represented the area of the courtyard of the Louvre, and a height half as deep again as the towers of Notre Dame. Nevertheless, the engineers had to leave a lake. The Persian touched a partition wall and said, "If I am not mistaken, this wall belongs to the house on the lake." Raoul flung himself against the wall and listened eagerly, but he heard nothing except distant steps sounding on the floor of the upper portions of the theatre. The Persian darkened his lantern again. "We shall try another way of getting in," and he led him back to the little staircase by which they had descended. They went up, stopping at each step until they reached the 3rd cellar. Here the Persian motioned to Raoul to go down on his knees, and in this way they crawled to the end wall. The Persian pressed against the wall. Then a stone gave way, leaving a narrow hole in the wall. He stopped almost at once. Raoul heard him say in a whisper, "We shall have to drop a few yards without making a noise. Take off your boots." He crawled a little further on his knees and then turned right round and, facing Raoul, said, "I am going to hang by my hands from the edge of the stone and let myself drop into his house. You must do exactly the same. Do not be afraid. I will catch you in my arms." Raoul soon heard a dull thud as the Persian jumped down and then dropped in his turn. "Shh!" whispered the Persian, and they stood motionless, listening. The Persian stooped and picked up something, a sort of cord, which he examined for a second and flung away with horror. "The Punjab lasso." "What is it?" "It might very well be the rope which Joseph Buquet was hanged with, the rope which they spent such a long time looking for." And suddenly, seized with a fresh anxiety, he moved his lantern over the walls, and then they saw a curious thing. The trunk of a tree, which seemed to be still quite alive, and the branches of that tree running right up the walls and disappearing into the ceiling. Because of the light's smallness, it was difficult at first to make out what it looked like. They saw a corner of a branch, a leaf, and then another leaf, and next to it nothing at all, but a ray of light that seemed to make its own reflection. Raoul passed his hand over that reflection. "The wall is a looking-glass." "Yes, a looking-glass." Passing the hand that held the pistol over his moist forehead, he said, "We have dropped into the torture chamber." What the Persian knew of this torture chamber, and what happened to his companion and himself, shall be told in his own words, as set down in a manuscript which he left behind him, and which I reproduce as I found it. The Persian's narrative. It was the first time that I had ever been to the house on the lake. I had often begged Eric to open its mysterious doors to me. He always refused. Watch him as I might, the darkness was always too impenetrable to allow me to see how he worked the door in the wall on the lake. One day, when I thought I was alone, I stepped into the boat and rowed towards that part of the wall through which I had seen Eric disappear. It was then that I heard the siren who guarded the approach, and whose charm was very nearly fatal to me. I had no sooner left the bank than the silence was disturbed by a sort of whispered singing that hovered all around me. It rose softly from the waters of the lake, following me, moving with me, and it was so soft that it did not even alarm me. On the contrary, in my longing to approach the source of that sweet and enticing harmony, I leaned out of my little boat, for I believed that the singing came from the water itself. By this time I was in the middle of the lake. The voice, for it was now distinctly a voice, was beside me in the water.
I leaned farther and farther over the side, and suddenly 2 monstrous arms seized me by the neck, dragging me down to the depths. I should certainly have been lost if I had not had time to give a cry, by which Eric knew me, for it was he in the water, and instead of drowning me, as was certainly his first intention, he swam with me and laid me gently on the bank. "How imprudent you are," he said as he stood before me, dripping with water. "Why do you try to enter my house? I did not invite you. I don't want you there, nor anybody, and you know that nothing can restrain Eric, not even Eric himself." "You nearly killed me. You know what you promised, Eric. No more murders." "Have I really committed murders?" he asked, putting on his most amiable air. "All that belongs to the past," I declared, and I took advantage of the turn in the conversation to speak to him of something that had long been on my mind. Eric, swear that—" "Swear what?" "You know I never keep my oaths. Oaths are made to catch fools with." "The chandelier, Eric." "What about the chandelier? You know what I mean." "Oh, I don't mind telling you about that. It wasn't I. The chandelier was very old and worn." When Eric laughed, he was more terrible than ever. He jumped into the boat, laughing so horribly that I could not help trembling. "Very old and worn, my dear Daroga." Daroga is Persian for chief of police. "And now, Daroga, take my advice and go and dry yourself, or you'll catch cold. And whatever you do, don't try to enter my house. I should be sorry to have to dedicate my requiem mass to you." So, still chuckling, he pushed off from shore and soon disappeared in the darkness of the lake. From that day I gave up all thought of penetrating into his house by way of the lake. That entrance was obviously too well guarded, especially since he had learned that I knew about it. But I felt that there must be another entrance, for I had often seen Eric disappear in the 3rd cellar, though I could not imagine how. By watching his movements, I soon discovered the curious relationship which existed between this monster and Christine Day. Hiding in her room, I listened to wonderful musical displays that evidently sent Christine into such ecstasy, but I was puzzled at how Eric's voice, which was as loud as thunder or as soft as an angel's voice, could have made her forget his ugliness. I understood, however, when I learned that Christine had never seen him. I went to the dressing-room, and remembering the lessons he had once given me, I had no difficulty in discovering the trick that made the wall with the mirrors swing round, and thus I ascertained the means by which he made his voice carry to Christine. In this way also I discovered the road that led to the well and the dungeon, the communard's dungeon, and also the trapdoor that enabled Eric to go straight to the cellars below the stage. I discovered that Christine was a prisoner in the house on the lake. Without hesitation I resolved to return to the shore, notwithstanding the certain danger. For 24 hours I lay watching for the monster to appear. I was beginning to think that he had gone through the other door in the 3rd cellar when I heard a slight splash in the dark. I saw the 2 yellow eyes shining like candles, and soon the boat touched the shore. Eric jumped out and walked up to me. His anger was terrible to see. "Yes, you must learn, once and for all. I tell you that with your recklessness I shall soon be discovered, and if I am, you will be in trouble. I won't be answerable for anything that happens to you. It's not Eric that I'm after. Who, then? You know as well as I do, it's Christine Day. I have every right to see her in my house. I am loved for my own sake. That's not true. You carried her off, and you're keeping her locked up. Christine Day shall leave as she pleases, and come back again. She will come back because she loves me for myself. I shall believe you if I see Christine Day come out of the house on the lake and go back to it of her own accord, and you won't meddle any more in my affairs. No. Very well. You shall see her tonight. Come to the masked ball. Christine and I will go, and then you can hide in her room where you will see her come back to me by the underground passage. I was greatly interested in the relationship between Eric and Christine Day, not from any morbid curiosity, but because of the terrible thought that Eric was capable of anything if he discovered that he was not loved for himself alone. I continued my investigations in the opera house, and soon discovered the truth of the matter. He filled Christine's mind through the terror with which he inspired her, but the child's heart belonged wholly to the Vicomte de Chagny. While they played about like an innocent couple, they little suspected that I was watching over their safety. I was prepared to go to any lengths to kill the monster, if necessary, and explain to the police afterwards. But Eric did not show himself, and I felt none the more comfortable for that. On the day of the abduction of Christine Day, I did not come to the theatre until rather late in the evening. Her abduction in the prison act, which naturally surprised everybody, found me prepared. It was quite certain that she had been spirited away by Eric, that prince of conjurers. The chances were in my favour that Eric at that moment was thinking only of his captive. This was the moment to enter his house through the third cellar, and I resolved to take with me the Vicomte de Chagny, who accepted with a confidence that touched me profoundly. He is a brave fellow, and he knew hardly anything about his adversary, which was all the better. I knew Eric too well to feel at all comfortable when I jumped into his house, for I knew what he had done in a certain palace at Mazenderan. He soon turned it into a house of the very devil, and with his trap-doors the monster was responsible for endless tragedies of all kinds. He hit upon astonishing inventions. Of these, the most curious, horrible, and dangerous was the so-called torture chamber. My alarm, therefore, was great when I saw that the room into which Monsieur le Vicomte de Chagny and I had dropped was an exact copy of the torture chamber of Mazenderan. At our feet I found the Punjab lasso which I had been dreading all the evening. I was convinced that this rope had already been used for Joseph Buquet, who, like myself, must have caught Eric one evening working the stone in the third cellar. He probably tried it in his turn and fell into the torture chamber. I could well imagine Eric dragging the body in order to get rid of it to the scene from the Roi de Lahore, and hanging it there as an example, or to increase the superstitious terror that would help him in guarding the approaches to his lair. We were then in the middle of a small hexagonal room, the sides of which were covered with mirrors from floor to ceiling. In the corners we could clearly see the joins in the glass, the segments intended to turn on their gears. Suddenly we heard noises on our left. It sounded at first like a door opening and shutting in the next room, and then we heard a dull moan. I clutched Monsieur de Chagny's arm when we distinctly heard these words: "You must make your choice. The wedding mass or the requiem mass." I recognized the voice of the monster. Then followed another moan, and complete silence. I was sure by now that the monster was unaware of our presence in his house, for otherwise he would certainly have kept silence. Besides, I was certain that if he had known of our presence, the tortures would have begun at once. The important thing was not to let him know, and I dreaded that the Vicomte de Chagny, who wanted to rush through the walls to Christine Day, would give us away. The requiem mass is not at all gay, whereas the wedding mass is magnificent. I can't go on living like this, like a mole under the ground. Don Juan triumphant is finished. Now I want to live like a normal man and have a wife like everybody else. You will be the happiest of women, you know, and we will sing all by ourselves until we swoon away with delight. You are crying. You are afraid of me. Yet I am not really wicked. Love me, and you shall see. All I wanted was to be loved for myself. If you loved me, I should be as gentle as a lamb, and you could do anything with me that you pleased. Monsieur de Chagny and I recognized that this terrible lamentation came from Eric himself. 3 times over, Eric fiercely bewailed his fate. You don't love me, you don't love me, you don't love me. Why do you cry? You know it hurts to see you cry. A silence. Suddenly, the silence in the next room was disturbed by the ringing of a bell. There was a sound on the other side of the wall, Eric's voice of thunder. Somebody ringing! Come in! Who has come bothering me now? Wait for me here. I'm going to tell the siren to open the door. We heard his steps move away, a door close. I had no time to think of the fresh horror that he was preparing. My only thought was that Christine was alone behind the wall. The Vicomte de Chagny was already calling to her. "Christine! Christine!" At last a faint voice reached us. "I am dreaming," it said. "Christine! It is Raoul!" Silence. "But answer me, Christine, in heaven's name, if you are alone. Answer me!" Then Christine's voice whispered Raoul's name. "Yes, yes, it is I. It is not a dream. Christine, trust me. We are here to save you, but be careful. When you hear the monster, warn us." Trembling lest Eric should discover where Raoul was hidden, she told us in a few hurried words that Eric had gone quite mad with love, and that he had decided to kill everybody and himself if she did not consent to become his wife. He had given her till 11 o'clock the next evening for reflection. If the answer was still no, he had repeated, "Everybody will be dead and buried." "Can you tell us where Eric is?" I asked. She replied that he must have left the house. "Could you make sure?" "No, I am fastened. I cannot stir a limb." When we heard this, Monsieur de Chagny and I were dumbfounded. Our safety, the safety of all the 3 of us, depended on the girl's freedom of movement. "There are only 2 doors in my room, one which Eric uses, and another which he has never opened, because he says it is the door to the torture chamber." "Christine, that is where we are." "You are in the torture chamber?" "Yes, but we cannot see the door." Oh, if only I could drag myself so far. I would knock at the door, and that would tell you where it is." "Is it a door with a lock on it?" "Yes, and I know where the key is," she said in a voice that seemed exhausted by the effort she had made. "But I am fastened so tight. Oh, the wretch!" "Where is the key?" "In the next room, near the organ, with another little bronze key. Oh, Raoul, fly! Everything is mysterious and terrible here, and Eric will soon have gone quite mad, and you are in the torture chamber. Go back the way you came." "Christine, we will go from here together or die together." "Mademoiselle," I declared, "the monster bound you, and he shall unbind you. You have only to play the necessary part. Remember that he loves you." "Alas, am I likely to forget it?" "Remember it. and smile on him, entreat him, tell him that your bonds hurt you.
Hush! I hear something in the wall on the lake. It is he. Go away! Go away!
Heavy steps dragged slowly behind the wall, then came a tremendous sigh, followed by a cry of pain from Christine, and we heard Eric's voice. "Why did you cry out, Christine?"
"Because I am in pain, Eric."
"I thought I had frightened you."
"Eric, unloose my bonds. Am I not your prisoner?"
"You will try to kill yourself."
"You have given me till 11 o'clock tomorrow evening, Eric."
The footsteps dragged along the floor once more. "After all, since we are to die together, and since I am just as eager to die as you are, yes, I have had enough of this life. Wait, don't move. I will release you. You have only one word to say. No, and it will be finished. There, turn round. You're free now. Oh, Christine, look at your poor dear wrists. Tell me, have I hurt them? That alone deserves death." "What have you done with my bag?" "So it was to take my bag that you asked me to release you."
"Listen to me, Eric. As it is settled that we are to live together, what difference can it make to you?"
"You know there are only 2 keys in it. What do you want to do?"
"I want to look at this room which I've never seen, which you have always kept hidden from me."
"Give me the key, will you, you inquisitive little thing?" And he chuckled, while Christine gave a cry of pain. Eric had evidently recovered the bag from her. At that moment, the Vicomte could not help himself any longer, and cried out with rage. "What's that? Did you hear that, Christine?"
No, I heard nothing."
"I thought I heard a cry."
"A cry? Are you going mad, Eric? Whom do you expect to cry out in this house? I cried out because you hurt me."
"You're trembling. You're lying. There was a cry. There is someone in the torture chamber. Ah, I understand now."
"There is no one there, Eric."
"I understand.
"No one."
The man you want to marry, perhaps?"
"I don't want to marry anybody. You know I don't."
Well, it won't take long to find out, Christine, my love. We need not open the door to see what is happening in the torture chamber. Would you like to see? If there is someone, you will see the invisible window light up at the top of the wall near the ceiling. We have only to draw back the black curtain and put on the light in here. There. That's it. Let's put out the lights. You're not afraid of the dark when you're with your husband." Then we heard Christine's cry of anguish.
"No, I'm frightened, I tell you. I'm afraid of the dark. I don't care about that room now."
And that which I feared above all things was set in motion. The room was suddenly flooded with light. The Vicomte de Chagny was so much taken by surprise that he staggered where he stood, and the angry voice roared, "I told you there was someone. Do you see the window now? The lighted window up there? The man behind the wall can't see it, but you shall go up the folding steps. That is what they are there for. You have often asked me to tell you, and now you know. They are there to see the torture chamber. Go and look through the little window, dear." We heard the steps being dragged against the wall. "Up with you!" "No? Then I will go up myself, dear."
"No, let me go."
At that moment we distinctly heard these words above our heads. "There is no one there, dear.
No one? Are you sure there is no one?
Of course. No one. What's the matter, Christine? You're not going to faint, are you, considering there is no one there? Here, come down. That's it. Pull yourself together. How do you like the view from the little window?
Oh, very much.
There, that's right. You're better now, aren't you? And what a funny house it is, isn't it?
It's very handsome. You're a great artist, Eric.
Yes, a great artist in my own line.
But tell me, Eric, why did you call that room the torture chamber?
Oh, it's very simple. First of all, what did you see?
I saw...
And you saw branches. And what is in the branches? There is a gibbet. And that is why I call my forest the torture chamber.
Christine was distraught. Put the light out in the little window. Eric, do put out the light.
For she saw that this light, which appeared so suddenly, and of which the monster had spoken in so threatening a voice, must mean something terrible. One thing must have pacified her for a moment, and that was seeing the two of us behind the wall in the midst of that dazzling light, alive and well. But then she cried out again, "What does this mean? The wall is quite hot. The wall is burning." "It is because of the forest next door."
"Oh, what has that got to do with it?"
"Why, didn't you see that it was an African forest?" And the monster laughed so loudly and hideously that we could no longer distinguish Christine's cries. The Vicomte de Chagny shouted and banged against the wall like a madman. I could not restrain him, but we heard nothing except the monster's laughter. Then there was the sound of a body falling on the floor and being dragged along. A door slammed, and then another. Nothing more, save the scorching silence of the torture chamber. There was only one possible outlet, that opening into the room where Eric and Christine Day were. But though this outlet looked like just an ordinary door on their side, it was absolutely invisible to us. When I was quite sure that there was no hope for us from Christine Day's side, I resolved to set to work without delay. But I had first to calm Monsieur de Chagny, who was already walking about like a madman, uttering incoherent cries. The snatches of conversation which he had caught between Christine and the monster had driven him mad with despair. Add to that the shock of the magic forest and the scorching heat which was beginning to make the perspiration stream down his temples, and you will have no difficulty in understanding his state of mind. He shouted Christine's name, brandished his pistol, and rushed against the glass walls in his endeavours to break through them. The torture was beginning to work its spell upon a brain unprepared to resist it. I did my best to induce the poor Viscount to listen to reason. I made him touch the mirrors and the iron trees and the branches, and explained to him logically all the luminous imagery which surrounded us. We are in a room, a little room. That is what you must keep saying to yourself, and we shall leave the room as soon as we have found the door. Forgetting the forest, I tackled the glass panel and began to finger it in every direction, hunting for the spot which I must press in order to turn the door. The spring might lay hidden under a mere speck on the glass, no larger than a pea. I hunted and hunted, feeling as high as my hands could reach. While groping over the successive panels with the greatest care, I endeavoured not to lose a minute, for I was feeling more and more overcome with the heat, and we were literally roasting in that blazing forest. I had been working like this for half an hour, and had finished 3 panels when, as ill luck would have it, I heard a muttered exclamation from the Viscount, and turned round. "I am stifling. All these mirrors are sending out an infernal heat. Do you think you will find that spring soon?
because if you are much longer about it, we shall be roasted alive." I returned to my panel after giving him a word of encouragement. Now the fever laid hold of me in turn, for I found nothing, absolutely nothing. In the next room all was silence. We were utterly lost in the forest, without an outlet, a compass, a guide, or anything. Oh, I knew what awaited us if we did not find the spring. But look as I might, I found nothing but branches, beautiful branches, that stood straight up before me, or spread gracefully over my head, but they gave no shade. We were literally beginning to die of heat, hunger, and thirst, of thirst especially. At last I saw Monsieur de Chagny raise himself on his elbow and point to a spot on the horizon. He had discovered an oasis. Yes, far in the distance was an oasis with limpid water. No, it was the mirage. I recognized it at once, the worst of all Eric's tricks. No one had ever been able to fight against it. I did my utmost to keep my head and not hope for water, because I knew that if a man hoped for water, there was only one thing for him to do: hang himself on the iron tree. "Don't look!" I cried to Monsieur de Chagny. "It's the mirage! Don't believe in water! It's another trick of the mirrors!" Then he flatly told me that I was mad to imagine that all the water flowing over there among those countless splendid trees was not real water. The forest was real, and it was no use trying to take him in. And he dragged himself along repeatedly over and over again, saying, "Water, water!" And his mouth was open as though he were drinking, and my mouth was open too, as though I were drinking. Lastly, and this was the most pitiless torture of all, we heard the rain, and it was not raining. Ah, you should have seen us putting out our tongues and dragging ourselves towards the rippling river bank. When we reached the mirror, Monsieur de Chagny licked it, and I also licked the glass. It was burning hot. Then we rolled on the floor, crying with despair. Monsieur de Chagny put the one pistol that was still loaded to his temple, and I stared at the Punjab lasso at the foot of the iron tree. Then, as I stared at it, I saw a thing which made me start so violently that I seized my friend by the arm and dragged myself on my knees towards what I had seen. I had discovered, near the Punjab lasso, in a groove in the floor, a black-headed nail, which I recognized. At last I had found the spring. I felt the nail, and as we watched in amazement, it yielded to my pressure. The mechanism released a trap-door in the floor. Cool air rushed up through the black hole below. We stooped down with our faces in the cool shade, and we drank in the coolness. I thrust my arm into the darkness and came upon a stone, then another, a dark staircase leading into the cellar. The Viscount wanted to fling himself down the hole, but fearing a new trick of the monster's, I stopped him, turned on my dark lantern, and went down first. The staircase was a winding one, and led down into pitchy darkness. We soon reached the bottom. Our eyes were beginning to accustom themselves to the dark, to distinguish shapes around us, circular shapes, on which I turned the light of my lantern. Barrels. We were in Eric's cellar. It was here that he must keep his wine, and perhaps his drinking water. Monsieur de Chagny patted the round shapes and kept on saying, "What a lot of barrels! What a lot of barrels!" Indeed, there was quite a number of them, symmetrically arranged in 2 rows, one on either side of us. Then, after half lifting one to make sure it was full, we went on our knees, and with the blade of a small knife which I carried, I prepared to stave in the bung hole. Monsieur de Chagny put his 2 hands together underneath it, and with a last effort I burst the bung. "What's this?" cried the Viscount. "This isn't water." I stooped to look, and at once threw away the lantern with such violence that it broke and went out, leaving us in utter darkness. What I had seen in Monsieur de Chagny's hands was gunpowder. The discovery flung us into a state of alarm that made us forget all our past and present sufferings. We now knew what the monster meant when he said to Christine Day, "If your answer is no, everybody will be dead or buried." Yes, buried under the ruins of the Paris Opera House. The monster had given her until 11 o'clock in the evening. He had chosen his time well. There would be many people up there in the theatre, and we would all be blown up in the middle of the performance if Christine Day said no. And what else could she say but no? She did not know that her decision would decide the fate of hundreds of people. We dragged ourselves through the darkness, feeling our way to the stone steps. At last I found the staircase, but suddenly I stopped on the first step, for a terrible thought had come into my mind. What was the time? 11 o'clock tomorrow evening might be now, might be this very moment. Who could tell us the time? We seemed to have been imprisoned in that hell for days and days, for years, since the beginning of the world. Perhaps we should be blown up then and there. Ah, a sound. A crack. Did you hear that? There, in the corner. Like a sound of machinery. Again. Oh, for a light. Perhaps it's the machinery which will blow everything up. Monsieur de Chagny and I began to yell like madmen. Fear spurred us on. We rushed up the staircase, stumbling as we went. We found the trapdoor still open, but it was now as dark in the room of mirrors as in the cellar we had just left. We dragged ourselves along the floor of the torture chamber, the floor between us and the gunpowder room. What was the time? We argued. We tried to calculate the time which we had spent there, but we were incapable of reasoning. If only we could see the face of a watch. Mine had stopped, but Monsieur de Chagny's was still going. He told me that he had wound it up before dressing for the opera. We had not a match upon us, so he broke the glass of his watch and felt the two hands. Judging by the space between the hands, he thought it might be just 11 o'clock. Suddenly I thought I heard footsteps in the next room. Someone tapped against the wall, and Christine's voice cried out, "Raoul! Raoul!" Christine sobbed and told us that the monster had done nothing but rave, waiting for her to give him the yes, which she refused. She had promised him that yes, if he would take her to the torture chamber, but he had been obstinate, and at last, after many hours of that hell, he had gone out, leaving her alone to reflect for the last time. What is the time now, Christine? 11 o'clock, in all but 5 minutes. He told me so before he went. He is quite mad. He said, 5 minutes, I leave you alone. And he gave me the little bronze key that opens the 2 ebony caskets on the mantelpiece. Then he said, in one of the caskets you will find a scorpion, in the other a grasshopper. They will say yes or no for you. If you turn the scorpion, I shall understand when I come back that you have said yes. The grasshopper will mean no. And he laughed like a demon. I did nothing but beg and entreat him to give me the key of the torture chamber, promising to be his wife if he granted me this request. But he told me that there was no further need for that key, and that he was going to throw it into the lake. And he laughed again and left me. There was a pause. "Christine," I cried, "where are you?" "By the scorpion." "Don't touch it." I had the idea that the monster had perhaps deceived the girl once more. Perhaps it was the scorpion that would blow everything up. After all, why wasn't he there? The 5 minutes were long past, and he was not back. Perhaps he had taken shelter and was waiting for the explosion. Why had he not returned? He could not really expect Christine ever to consent to becoming his voluntary prey. "Don't touch the scorpion," I repeated. "Here he comes. I hear him. Here he is. We heard his steps approaching the Louis-Philippe room. He came up to Christine, but did not speak. Then I raised my voice. Eric, it is I. Do you know me? With extraordinary calmness, he at once replied, So you are not dead in there. Well then, keep quiet. I tried to speak, but he said coldly, Not a word, Doroga, or I shall blow everything up. The honor rests with Mademoiselle. Mademoiselle has not touched the scorpion nor the grasshopper. If you turn the grasshopper, Mademoiselle, we shall all be blown up. There is enough gunpowder under our feet to blow up half of Paris. If you turn the scorpion, all that powder will be flooded by the lake. Now, to celebrate our wedding, you shall make a very handsome present to a few hundred Parisians who are at this moment applauding a poor masterpiece of Meyerbeer's. You shall make them a present of their lives. For with your own fair hands you shall turn the scorpion, and merrily, merrily we shall be married. If in 2 minutes, Mademoiselle, you have not turned the scorpion, I shall turn the grasshopper, and the grasshopper, I assure you, will hop high. There was a terrible silence again. The Vicomte de Chagny, realizing that there was nothing left to do but pray, went down on his knees and prayed. The 2 minutes are gone. Goodbye, Mademoiselle. Hop, grasshopper. Eric, do you swear to me that the scorpion is the one to turn? Yes, to hop at our wedding. Ah, you see, you said to hop. At our wedding, ingenuous child, the scorpion opens the ball. But that will do, that will do. You won't have the scorpion? Then I turn the grasshopper. Eric, enough! I was crying out in concert with Christine. Monsieur de Chagny was still on his knees praying. Eric, I have turned the scorpion. Oh, the second which we waited to find ourselves blown to fragments amid the roar of the explosion. It came softly at first, then louder, then very loud, but it was not the hiss of fire. It was more like the hiss of water, and now it became a gurgling sound. We rushed to the trapdoor. All our thirst, which had vanished when the terror came, now returned with the sound of the water. The water rose in the cellar, above the powder barrels, and spread over the floor of the room. If this went on, the whole house on the lake would be swamped. Surely there was water enough now. Eric must stop it now. Eric, that is water enough for the gunpowder. Turn it off. Turn off the scorpion. But Eric did not reply. We heard nothing but the water rising, now halfway up to our waists. Christine! Cried Monsieur de Chagny. Christine, the water is up to our knees. But Christine did not reply. We heard nothing but the water rising. There was no one in the next room, no one to turn the tap, no one to turn the scorpion. We were alone, left to drown. By this time we had lost our foothold and were carried away by the water, which dashed us against the dark mirrors, then thrust us back again. Our voices, raised above the roar of the whirlpool, shouted in vain for help. Our arms became entangled as we tried to swim. We choked. We struggled in the dark water. Already we could hardly breathe above the water, as the air was escaping through some hole or other in the ceiling. I lost my strength. I tried in vain to lay hold of the glass walls. We whirled around again. We began to sink. One last effort, a last cry, Eric! Christine! Then I lost consciousness entirely. That is the end of the written story which the Persian left behind. Notwithstanding the horrors of a situation which seemed to abandon them to their deaths, Monsieur de Chagny and his companion were saved by the sublime devotion of Christine Daae. I had the rest of the story from the lips of the daroga himself. When I went to see him, he was still living in his little flat in the Rue de Rivoli, opposite the Tuileries. He was very ill, and it took all my persuasion as an historian to persuade him to live the incredible tragedy over again for my benefit. His poor face looked very worn, but his mind was quite clear, and he told me his story with perfect lucidity. It seems that when he opened his eyes, the daroga found himself lying on a bed. An angel and a devil were watching over them. After the fantastic deceptions and illusions of the torture chamber, the normality of their quiet little room seemed invented for the express purpose of once more puzzling the mind of the mortal rash enough to stray into that house of living nightmare. And the masked figure seemed all the more formidable in this old-fashioned setting. It bent down over the Persian and said in his ear, "Are you better, daroga?" Christine Daae did not say a word. She moved about noiselessly, like a sister of charity who had taken a vow of silence. She brought a cup of cordial or of hot tea, he did not remember which. The man in the mask took it from her hands and gave it to the Persian. Monsieur de Chagny was still sleeping. Eric poured a drop of rum into the daroga's cup and, pointing to the Vicomte, said, "He came to himself long before we knew if you were still alive. He is quite well and sleeping." Eric left the room for a moment, and the Persian raised himself on his elbow, looked around and saw Christine sitting by the fireside. He called to her, but he was still very weak and fell back on his pillow. She came to him, laid her hand on his forehead and went away again. And the Persian remembered that as she went, she did not so much as glance at Monsieur de Chagny, who was sleeping peacefully, and she sat down again in her chair by the chimney corner. Eric returned with some little bottles which he placed on the mantelpiece, and again, in a whisper, so as not to wake Monsieur de Chagny, he said to the Persian, after feeling his pulse, "You are now saved, both of you, and soon I shall take you up to the surface of the earth again, to please my wife." Thereupon he rose, without further explanation, and disappeared once more. The Persian now looked at Christine's quiet profile under the lamp. She was reading a tiny book with gilt edges. Very gently he called her again, but Christine was wrapped in her book and did not hear him. Eric returned, mixed the daroga a draught, and advised him not to speak to his wife again, nor to anyone, because it might be very dangerous to everybody. Eventually, the Persian fell asleep, like Monsieur de Chagny, and did not wake until he was in his own room, nursed by his faithful servant, who told him that on the night before he had been found propped against the door of his flat, where he had been brought by a stranger who rang the bell before going away. As soon as the daroga recovered his strength and his wits, he sat down to write. He had just written the last line of the narrative which I have quoted in the preceding pages, when his servant announced the visit of a stranger who refused his name, who would not show his face, and who declared simply that he did not intend to leave the place until he had spoken to the daroga. The Persian guessed at once who his singular visitor was, and ordered him to be shown in. It was Eric. He looked extremely weak, and leant against the wall as though afraid of falling. Taking off his hat, he revealed a forehead white as wax. The rest of his face was hidden by the mask. The Persian rose to his feet as Eric entered. "Murderer! What have you done with Monsieur de Chagny and Christine Daae?" Eric bowed his head and said, "I have come here to tell you that I am going to die.
Where are Raoul de Chagny and Christine Day? Daroga, I'm dying of love. I loved her so, and I love her still, Daroga. If you knew how beautiful she was when she let me kiss her. It was the first time, Daroga, the first time I ever kissed a woman. I kissed her alive, and she looked as beautiful as if she had been dead. The Persian shook Eric by the arm. Will you tell me if she is alive or dead? Why do you shake me like that? Asked Eric, making an effort to control himself. I tell you, I'm going to die. Yes, I kissed her alive. And now she is dead? I tell you, I kissed her just like that, on her forehead, and she did not draw back her forehead from my lips. Oh, she is a good girl. As to her being dead, I don't think so. It has nothing to do with me. No, she is not dead, and no one shall touch a hair of her head. She is a good, honest girl, and she saved your life, Daroga, at a moment when I would not have given twopence for your Persian skin. After all, who cared about you? But she had turned the scorpion, and she had, through her own free will, become engaged to me. When you were drowning, Christine came to me and swore that she would be my living wife. She said she would not kill herself. It was a bargain. A minute later, all the water was back in the lake, and I had a hard job carrying you, Daroga. Upon my honor, I thought you were dead. It was understood that I would take you both up to the surface of the earth. But what have you done with Vicomte de Chagny? Interrupted the Persian. Ah, you see, Daroga, I couldn't carry him up like that at once. He was a hostage. But I could not keep him in the house on the lake either, because of Christine. So I locked him up comfortably in the Communard's dungeon, which is in the most remote and deserted part of the opera, below the 5th cellar, where no one ever comes and no one ever hears you. Then I went back to Christine. She was waiting for me. Eric rose solemnly. Then he continued, but as he spoke, he trembled with emotion. Yes, she was waiting for me, a real, living bride. And when I came forward, more timid than a little child, she did not run away. I even believe that she put out her forehead a little, or not much, just a little, like a living bride, and I kissed her, and she did not die. Oh, how good it is to kiss a person. My mother, my poor unhappy mother, would never let me kiss her. She used to run away, nor any other woman ever. You can understand my happiness was so great I fell at her feet, crying, and I kissed her feet, her little feet, crying. You're crying too, Daroga. And she too, the angel, cried. Eric sobbed aloud, and the Persian himself could not restrain his tears. Yes, I felt her tears on my forehead. They mingled with the tears in my eyes. They flowed between my lips. Listen, Daroga, listen to what I did. I tore off my mask so as not to lose one of her tears, and she did not run away, and she did not die. She was alive. She wept with me. I have tasted all the happiness the world can offer. I am not
going to die yet. Presently I shall, but let me tell you, while I was at her feet I heard her say, 'Poor unhappy Eric.' And she took my hand. I had become no more than a poor dog ready to die for her. I held out a ring, a plain gold ring which I had given her, which she had lost, and I had found again. I slipped it into her little hand and said, 'There, take it for you and him. It is my wedding present to you both. A present from your poor, unhappy Eric. I know you love him, so don't cry any more.' Then she asked me, in a very soft voice, what I meant. I made her understand that I was ready to die for her, and that she should marry the young man when she pleased, because she had wept with me and mingled her tears with mine. Eric's emotion was so great that he had to tell the Persian not to look at him, for he was choking and must take off his mask. The daroga went to the window and opened it. His heart was full of pity, but he took care to keep his eyes fixed on the trees in the Tuileries gardens, lest he should see the monster's face. I went and released the young man, and told him to come with me to Christine. They embraced before me in the Louis-Philippe room. Christine had my ring. I made her swear to come back one night when I was dead, and bury me in the greatest secrecy with the gold ring, which she was to wear until that moment. I told her where she would find my body and what to do with it. Then Christine kissed me for the first time herself, here, on the forehead. "Don't look, daroga!" They went off together. Christine had stopped crying. I alone cried. Alone. "Daroga, if Christine keeps her promise, she will come back soon." The Persian asked him no questions. He was quite reassured as to the fate of Raoul Chagny and Christine Day. No one could have doubted the word of the weeping Eric that night. The monster put on his mask once again and collected his strength to leave. He told the daroga that when he felt his end to be close at hand, he would send him, in gratitude for the kindness which the Persian had once shown him, the things which he held most dear, all Christine Day's letters to Raoul, which she had left with Eric, together with a few objects belonging to her, a pair of gloves, a shoe buckle, and 2 pocket handkerchiefs. Eric told him that the young people had resolved to go and look for a priest in some lonely spot where they could hide their happiness. Lastly, Eric relied on the Persian, as soon as he received the promised relics and papers, to inform the young couple of his death and to put a notice in the Epoque. That was all. The Persian saw Eric to the door of his flat, and the servant helped him down to the street. A carriage was waiting for him. Eric stepped in, and the Persian, who had gone back to the window, heard him say to the driver, "To the opera." With that, the carriage drove off into the night. The Persian had seen the poor, unfortunate Eric for the last time. 3 weeks later, the Epoque published this advertisement: "Eric is dead.